The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. I spent the night in a forest in Chernobyl with mutated animals. I found a mummified corpse holding a list of rules. The area where we were heading in Eastern Europe was known for its radioactivity. We had received reports of strange animals, things that looked like they were hatched from a mad scientist's laboratory. I didn't know how much of it I believed, because some of the descriptions the survivors gave sounded more like Wendigo and dogmen than any real animal. I figured that, in the heat of the moment and under attack, their minds had likely twisted the true form of the animals, horrifying as they were, into something truly nightmarish. There were 3 of us heading into the dark Eastern European forests. My friend Dmitri, who was originally from the country and knew the language, his girlfriend Anna, and myself. Everything seemed mundane enough as we flew into the country and handed over our passports. There was no sign of the horrors waiting ahead. The first towns we encountered looked idyllic enough as we drove through them in a rental car. Isolated farmhouses with cows and chickens dotted the landscape. Plentiful fields of wheat, potatoes and corn stretched out on all sides of us. The black earth here was fertile, I knew, as we headed deeper into the radiation zone. However, the houses and farms all started to look abandoned and dilapidated, the fields barren and dead. Christ on a cracker, I muttered, more to myself than to my friends. This place looks like it suffered through the apocalypse. It did, Dmitri said grimly. A nuclear apocalypse. I feel like the biblical one is far more optimistic than the true apocalypse will be. In reality, there will be no rapture, no victory of light over darkness. If there is ever a World War III, every major city will be consumed by nuclear fire. It will throw buses and cars thousands of feet into the air, spilling out bodies onto the burning skies. Entire streets will collapse, trapping countless millions under the rubble. That's a cheerful thought, Anna commented, her dark blue eyes staring out the window. I saw the reflection of white eyes skittering through the brush outside, small animals that disappeared in front of the approaching roar of the engine. How far is it? I asked, feeling carsick and anxious. The winding roads here curved through countless hills. It reminded me of driving through parts of Northern California before, when I had retched out the window. Anna and Dmitri seemed unaffected, though I cursed my stomach, which was always turning traitorous towards me. It's a while, man, Dmitri said. This country is huge, probably another 3 or 4 hour drive, and then we have to start walking. Good thing we left before dawn, Anna said, stifling a yawn. She had a can of some cheap Russian Red Bull knockoff, some fluorescent green crap that smelled like chemicals, but she drank it as if it were the finest French wine. I gazed out at the dark forests that passed us on both sides, wondering what kind of sights lay ahead in this land of the damned. The sun rose early over the gently rolling hills and black earth of Ukraine, sending its rusty streaks of blood across the sky. The going had been easy so far, except for the constant car sickness I felt. I took a few pills of meclizine, wishing that I could have smuggled some weed gummies through customs. But here, cannabis was illegal, and I was not eager to see the inside of an Eastern European prison, where lunatics like the 3 guys 1 hammer maniacs and the chessboard killer lived in hellish conditions. Holy shit. Would you look at that? Dmitri said with awe and wonder oozing from his voice as the car braked abruptly. I looked up quickly, my stomach doing flips. But what I saw laying across the road instantly brought me back to the moment. Dmitri pointed a tattooed hand at the sight. Is that real? Anna asked. I could only shake my head as we all stared at the dead bear that was laying across the cracked road, its dead eyes staring straight through us. I noticed immediately that the bear had extra paws on its arms. Blood-stained claws jutted sharply out of its 4 paws, each seeming to have 7 fingers. Its feet looked stunted and twisted, like the roots of a tree. An extra arm stuck out of the front of its chest, a pale, white fleshy growth emerging from its sternum. The mutated limb looked malformed and boneless, causing a sense of revulsion to rise up as I gazed on it. It flopped gently in the heavy wind that swirled down the surrounding hills. "Well, I guess the rumors are true," Dmitri said slowly, his eyes as wide and excited as a child. "Can you imagine what other kinds of things must be lurking in these forests? This is going to make a really awesome documentary." Anna nodded, playing with a small, handheld digital camera she took everywhere with her. She wanted to make a video that would finally go viral on the internet and help her gain some recognition for her work. "I'm going to record everything, including this," she said excitedly, brushing a lock of blonde hair behind her ear as she opened the door of the car. Dawn had risen overhead, radiating the first warm rays of a bright summer day. After a long moment, I followed her out. Dmitri stood at her side, his dark eyes wide. He ran a trembling hand over his shaved head as he looked down at the enormous bear. Anna zoomed in with the camera, kneeling down before the still beast. Her finely formed fingers shook with excitement as she drew within inches of the corpse. I wondered how the bear had died, as I didn't see any signs of injuries on the creature's body. The next moment, I saw it blink. I backpedaled away, giving a hoarse, guttural shout of warning. Anna was busy staring at the screen of the digital camera, scanning it across the bear's extra fingers and limbs. But the panic that swept over Dmitri's face showed me that he, too, had seen it. He grabbed Anna's arm, dragging her back with sudden fury. She stumbled, her legs crossing under her. She crashed into him and they fell back together. A moment later, the bear came to life, its bones cracking as it twisted its head to look at the 3 of us. It swiped a mutated paw at the place where Anna's face had been only a moment before. I heard the sharp claws slice through the air like switchblades. The bear's head ratcheted over to glare at us. It gnashed its teeth as silver streams of saliva flew from its shaking head. With a primal roar, it leapt off the ground. I turned to run back to the safety of the car, but I nearly tripped when a pale figure streaked out of the forest right in front of me. It looked like something conjured up in a nightmare. It was naked and bloated, its skin white with bulging, pink cheeks. It looked to have a combination of human and pig features, and yet it ran upright like a person. Its irises were blood red, its pupils huge and excited. Its beady eyes flicked over to Anna, and a low, satisfied growl erupted from its wide throat. I watched the muscles work furiously in its porcine body as it sprinted towards her. Before either Dmitri or I could react, the pig thing grabbed Anna around the neck, its sharp, black fingers digging deeply into her skin. She squealed like a strangled rabbit as it dragged her away into the dark Ukrainian forests. Its pink lips pulled back in an excited grimace, revealing the sharp fangs underneath. I heard its guttural growls fade away rapidly. It sprinted much faster than a person, its hooves slamming the ground over and over at a superhuman speed. "Hey," Dmitri called excitedly, taking a step forward. "What do you—" A giant bear paw with too many gleaming claws smacked his leg out from under him, sending him flying. I only stood there, shell-shocked and amazed, as Anna disappeared into the trees. A single moment later, the bear rose to its full height, roaring at us. Streams of spit flew from its mouth as its rancid breath washed over us, breath that emanated a smell like roadkill and infection. I put my hands up, flinching, expecting a blow that never came. When I looked up, the bear had gone back on all fours. It ran in the path the pig creature had gone, its white, boneless extra limb hanging limply from its chest. "What the fuck?" Dmitri cried on the ground, rocking back and forth. I came back to life, running over to his side. I saw deep gouge marks slice through his blue jeans, Bright streams of blood lazily dripped from the claw marks on his left leg. "We need to get help," I cried, shaking him. His eyes looked far away and confused, as if he didn't fully realize what was happening. "We need to go back and get the police." "The police?" he asked, laughing. "The police here won't do anything. You think they're going to travel out into the radioactivity zone just for a missing person?" He shook his head grimly before reaching out a hand to me. "Help me up. There's a first aid kit in the car. We need to bandage this up. Then we're going after Anna." We had no way to call for help. The phones this far out in Chernobyl didn't work, and there were never any cell phone towers built in the silent land. After Dmitri had disinfected and bandaged his legs, he rummaged through the trunk, looking for weapons. "God damn. There's nothing good here," he said despondently. "Some bear mace, some knives. What good is any of that going to do against these mutated monsters? We need an AK-47. I nodded in agreement. "Too bad we're not in the US, I said. "The only guns you're going to get around here are the ones you take off the bodies of Russian soldiers." "Yeah, if only," he muttered sadly, handing me a large folding knife. "We have 1 canister of bear mace, 3 knives and a tire iron. Not exactly an arsenal." I really didn't want to go into those dark woods, but thinking of Anna being tortured or murdered made me feel sick and weak. I shook my head, mentally torn. "Here, take the bear mace. 2, I'll take the tire iron and a knife," he continued, forcing the black canister into my numb fingers. "You ready for this?" "Absolutely not," I said. "I think we should try to find help. If we both go out there and get slaughtered, no one will ever find Anna. The nearest town is 2 hours west of here," he responded icily. "By the time we get help, her trail will have gone cold. It will take at least 5 or 6 hours to get any rescue out here. No, we need to do this, and we need to do it now. If you don't want to come, I'll come," I said grimly, my heart pounding. Fuck it. Dmitri had a sad history. As a child living in Ukraine, he had been kidnapped by an insane neighbor and kept in a dirt pit outside for weeks, wallowing in his own piss and shit. Slowly starving, he said the man would throw down a stale crust of bread or a rice cake into the mud and human waste every few days. Dmitri would pull the food out, wipe off the feces and eat it. I shuddered, remembering the horror stories he had told me. I knew he had a personal reason for making sure Anna was not subjected to the same endless suffering, even if it meant his own death. The bear and the pig creature had left a clear trail of broken brush and snapped twigs snaking through the forest. Side by side, we moved cautiously ahead, constantly checking our backs, but we saw no signs of movement and heard nothing. Up ahead, the trees abruptly opened up, letting golden sunlight stream down. Blinking quickly, we left the forest behind. We walked out into a field in the middle of a valley surrounded by tall, dark hills. Grass and weeds rippled in waves as the wind swept past us. Formed in a semicircle in front of us, human skeletons lay endlessly dreaming. They stared up into the vast blue sky with grinning skulls and empty sockets. Some still had putrefying strips of flesh and ligaments clinging to the bones. Animals had scattered some of the bodies, but others lay complete, like corpses in a tomb. Human skulls, leg bones and arm bones lay scattered haphazardly across the field, their surfaces yellowed and cracked with age. It looked like a bone orchard. "What are we looking at right now?" I whispered, furtively glancing around at the field of bones. An insane part of my mind wondered if they might rise from the dead and come after us. Compared to what we had already seen in this place of nightmares, it didn't seem that far-fetched. "Dead bodies," Dmitri said grimly. "Victims of the nuclear accident?" I asked. He shook his head, pointing at some of the fresher corpses nearby. Their throats looked like they had been ripped out, the bones of their necks showing deep bite marks. The one nearest us had its skeletal fingers wrapped around a glass bottle with a piece of paper rolled inside and a cork inserted into the top. I knelt down, prying the fingers back with soft, cracking noises. I uncorked it and took out the paper. It felt thick in my hands, like some kind of handcrafted paper from the old days. The cursive flowing across the sheet looked like it had been written in a quill pen with actual ink. In confusion, I read the letter aloud. Rules to survive in the Hellskin Nature Preserve. 1. The cult known as the Golden Butchers has been kidnapping women to breed them with the pig creatures. They worship the offspring that result from these unions as gods. If a member of your group gets taken, you will find them in the living farm at the end of the forest. 2. If you encounter Mr. Welcome, the enormous pig god with the eyes on his forehead, you must not let him touch you. 3. The red snakes can only see while you're moving. If you encounter them, stay still, don't even breathe. Breeding women with pig creatures? Dmitri cried, horror washing over his face. We need to find her, but where do we even start? I looked through the field, trying to see any sign of tracks, but it looked like hundreds of animals had gone through this field recently. Paths of tall, crushed grass crisscrossed the enormous length of it, some of them worn down to black dirt and stones. I just shook my head, having no idea. A distant scream rolled its way down the surrounding hills. It came from our left and sounded very much like Anna. Dmitri's eyes turned cold. Without looking back at me, he started frantically running towards the sound. It faded away within seconds. "Wait up!" I cried, sprinting as fast as I could. His freshly shaved head gleamed as he disappeared into the trees. Gripping the open buck knife in my hand, my knuckles white with tension and fear, I followed after him. We wandered for hours through the woods, never hearing a second scream to guide our path. We both hoped that we were going in the right direction. A small deer trail winding through the brush opened up, heading up rocky hills and clear streams of water. Sweating and nervous, we traveled for miles and miles, rarely talking. A few times, I tried to get Dmitri to slow down. "How do you know you're going in the right direction?" I asked. "We've been walking this trail for 5 hours and haven't seen a thing." This was the direction the scream came from, he said weakly. Where else would they go? They would want to travel quickly with a hostage. They would take a trail. I didn't point out that there may be other trails, that we had absolutely no idea where we were going. As we reached the peak of a mountain, I pulled a small, portable Geiger counter we had taken along for the trip. The radioactivity here was high, much higher than normal background radiation. I didn't know how far we were from the nuclear power plant at the center of all this, but at a certain point, it would become too dangerous to keep moving forward. Dmitri was next to me, chugging a bottle of water, when a shriek rang out below us. It sounded almost animalistic, but had a strange, electronic distortion, amplified to an ear-splitting cacophony. It echoed through the trees. Much quieter roars answered from the forests all around us in response. The cries of bears and other predators. These sounded much closer. However, "Psst," a pile of thick ferns said to my left, shaking suddenly. In Ukrainian, the ferns continued by whispering, "Hey, you!" I jumped, swinging the knife in the direction of the brush, watching the blade shake wildly in my hand as fresh waves of adrenaline surged through my body. Dmitri was by my side, his eyes wide and wild. He glanced over at me, nodding. He had the tire iron raised like a tennis racket, ready to strike. A moment later, a little boy crawled out. He was scarecrow thin, his face smudged with dirt and filth, his dark eyes sunken and lifeless deep inside his small head. He had black hair and a nose like a little twisted lump in the center of his face. It seemed like it had been repeatedly broken. He didn't look older than 10, but he looked so emaciated that it was impossible to say. The rags and tatters he wore barely covered his body, and the boy was almost in his Genesis suit. "Come out," I said grimly. Dmitri's eyes bulged from his head. "Don't kill me. Please," the boy whispered in a cracked, choked voice, his accent giving all his words a guttural tone. "Take me out of here. My mom and dad brought me here. They were part of the Golden Butchers, but a couple months ago, they got sick and died from all the poison in the water and food." Who are you? Kid? Dmitri said, reaching down and pulling him up to his feet. I watched the boy closely, the bear mace in one hand and the knife in the other, looking for any sign of sudden violence or betrayal. My name is Philip. I come from the farm, he said, pointing vaguely towards the tallest peak in the area. You can't see it from here, but it's over there. Dmitri kneeled down until he was eye to eye with Philip. Can you take us there? He said. Philip's eyes teared up, but he slowly nodded. If you will take me with you when you leave, I'll show you, he said, crying now, but it is a horrible place. It is the place of Mr. Welcome. Philip guided us to the living farm, saving us a great deal of time. He navigated the forest like an experienced hiker, seeming to know the entire area from the smallest clues. A split, fallen tree, or a tree with a whirl like an eye, or a sudden curve in a babbling brook. It saved us a great deal of time wandering through the woods, where everything looked exactly the same to me. There, he said, pointing through a break in the trees to the farm. The entire top of the hill was cleared of trees and brush. In its place stood a nightmare. The farm was the closest place to hell I have ever seen. The top of the living building peeked over the tall trees surrounding it. It had something like a bell tower on the top of it, almost like a church might have, but instead of a bell, it had an enormous, bloodshot eye. The eye had an iris as red as a dismembered heart. Its pupil was dilated and insane. From here, the eye looked to be about the size of a church bell and had no eyelids. Strange white filaments like those of a slime mold surrounded it, trailing down into the building. I wondered if this was the optic nerve for the great, staring eye. The rest of the building was as black as eternity, windowless and imposing. It had a brutalist architecture, all sharp angles and steep slopes. I watched the building and the eye closely. To my horror, I realized that the entire thing was alive somehow. The eye constantly spun in its place, staring out over the surrounding hills like the eye of Sauron. The building constantly breathed. Welcome, a hushed, distorted voice cried. The words seemed to come from the breathing and living walls of the farm itself. Welcome. Welcome. What the fuck is this? Kid? Dmitri whispered hoarsely. Where's Anna? Philip shook his head sadly. She's inside with the other breeders, he said, the fear and terror evident on his face. They keep them chained in cages or bound in the basement until the time for the ritual comes. And when is that? I asked. He looked up at the sky and the fading light. We had somehow wasted nearly an entire day already. Night was coming, and we hadn't even seen Anna yet. At sunset, he responded. Dmitri nearly jumped up at that. Sunset? That's almost here. We need to go now, he cried. I almost wanted to laugh. What are you going to do? Stab that enormous building with your knife? I whispered. We need a plan. Maybe we can burn it down or... But my words were cut off by the roaring of the building. Its scream echoed over the hills. It was immediately answered by countless others, including one that came only a few dozen feet behind us. I grabbed Dmitri's shoulder, my panicked eyes flicking in that direction. There's something, I started to say when the brush cracked under a heavy weight. Looking up, I saw something horrible stalking us from behind. It looked like a pig, walking on all fours with a fat, bloated body, but it was the size of an SUV. Its eyes were like the eye in the building, blood red and dilated, all over its body. Hundreds of sharp teeth grew out of its skin, covering the pink flesh like tumors. The creature almost looked like a porcupine with all the sharp points of fangs projecting from its body. For a moment, its eyes widened as we stared at each other. They instantly narrowed as the pig roared again and gave chase. It gnashed its teeth, opening and closing its mouth in a frenzy of bloodlust. In its mouth, too, the teeth grew wild. Hundreds of razor-sharp teeth of different sizes grew from its gums, tongue and lips. Run, I cried, grabbing Philip's arm and hauling him off the ground. The boy had a natural survivor's instincts and immediately started running by my side. away from the approaching creature. We broke out into the massive clearing where the living farm stood. I saw that the building had only a single door in and out, a black barn door that stood wide open. I heard Dimitri's feet pounding the ground behind me. The heavy thuds of the approaching creature drew louder by the second. "In the barn," I cried, not having time to think. It was the only possible place of safety here. I sprinted faster than I ever had before towards those doors, as if they were entrance to paradise itself. Without slowing, I ran into the building, trying to slam one of the doors shut behind me. Dimitri grabbed the other. With the creature only seconds away, they started swinging shut. Philip's small body pressed against my leg as he came forward, using his meager strength to help me. The door was extremely heavy and hard to move. The building itself looked like it was 6 or 7 stories tall, and the doors to the barn nearly a third of that height. With a tortured creak, they slammed shut. A single breath later, something heavy thudded against the other sides, as if it had been hit by a battering ram, but the door held. Quickly, Dimitri and I grabbed a large board leaning against the wall and stuffed it into the brackets on both sides of the door, locking it from the inside. I noticed how cool and dark it was in here, as if I had walked into a cave. I turned, taking in the interior of the living farm for the first time. At that moment, I had to repress a scream welling up in my throat. Hundreds of imprisoned women both lined both sides of the barn. They were stacked one on top of another like prison cells, wearing filthy, blood-stained rags. Most of them looked silently down on us with dead, haunted eyes. I noticed the majority were in their 20s or 30s, but their eyes looked centuries old. Along the back wall, an enormous pig lined the wall, positioned like Jesus on the cross. It stood as tall as the barn itself. Extra eyes covered its face, a dozen of them positioned all over its cheeks and forehead. From the top of its head, I saw white filaments rising up into the bell tower, its many blood-red eyes focused on us, as still as death. "Welcome," it hissed. "Welcome." Its limbs were chained to the wall, enormous rusted links intertwined around its body, preventing Mr. Welcome from moving. "Anna?" Dimitri cried. Looking around frantically, there was no one else here that I could see except for Mr. Welcome and all the hostages. "Anna."
"Where are you?"
"Don't scream," Philip said in a tiny, fear-choked voice. "Please, don't scream." But it was too late. As Dimitri's last words faded, trapdoors built into the black floor of the barn sprung open. Dozens of mutated bears and pig creatures crept out, their predatory eyes scanning us with hunger and anger. "Fuck," Dimitri cried, running back to the door at my side. Frantically, the three of us pulled the board up and dropped it to the fleshy floor with a clatter, as hisses and growls erupted all around us, and the predators creeped forwards towards us in a semicircle. The barn door flew open. It was night now, the darkness creeping in like a descending curtain. No pig creatures awaited us on the other side, but something worse seemed to be creeping out of the forest. I saw snakes the color of clotted blood slithering ahead. Each one was the size of a tractor trailer, yet they made very little noise. An occasional hiss would rip its way through the air, but they hunted silently. As I stood in the field in front of the barn, a no-man's land of hellish proportions, the certainty of death fell over my heart like grasping skeletal hands. I looked down at the little boy sadly. He gave me a faint smile, even though his eyes were terrified. "I think we're fucked," Dimitri whispered by my side. I only nodded. But at that moment, I remembered the rules, and an idea came to me. "Just stay still," I said. "Don't even breathe." Philip and Dimitri looked at me strangely. Then recognition came over their eyes. Dimitri only nodded, and then we all played statue. The predators from the barn were only 30 feet behind us by now, crouched down and hunting us like a cat with a mouse. Yet the snakes also closed in, their black, slitted eyes gleaming with a reptilian coldness. As the mutated bears and pig creatures leaned down to pounce, I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. I felt a sudden rush of air all around me, The snakes flitted forward in a blur, their massive jaws unhinging. Two fangs swiveled out like switchblades, fangs big enough to impale a police car. Drops of clear venom fell lazily from the ends. Keeping my eyes closed, afraid to even breathe or blink, I listened as the sounds of tearing flesh and screaming animals resonated all around me. After about 30 seconds of this, everything went deathly silent. I don't know how long we stood there like statues, but eventually, someone touched my shoulder. I opened my eyes, unbelieving. Dimitri stared at me intently. "They're all gone," he whispered. "All except Mr. Welcome. It's now or never." I nodded, and together we moved into the farm. The trapdoors still lay open. I could hear very faint sobbing coming from under the building. Dimitri was afraid to make a sound. Together, the three of us went down to investigate. We found a dark basement covered in hay. Torture tools covered the walls, iron maidens, brazen bulls, crosses, and an entire universe of whips, saws, grinders, pliers, razor wire, and other blood-stained tools of the trade. In the corner, we saw Anna, her hands tied to the wall. More rope bound her feet and legs. We ran forward. When Anna saw Dimitri, she collapsed into a nervous wreck. "Oh my God, you came! Please, get me out of here. Right now," she whispered. "They're coming. The ritual will start soon." Without a word, we started cutting the ropes, freeing her quickly. "We need to be as quiet as possible," I told Anna. "We can all get out of here. Let's go." As we ascended from the basement back to the main floor of the living farm, the repetitive, metallic voice of Mr. Welcome kept repeating the same insane mantra. "Welcome," it said. "Welcome," once the four of us were all together. However, it changed. "Welcome, thieves," it hissed, its voice deepening and turning into a demonic gurgle. "That is my breeder. You will have to find out what happens to thieves." I could only imagine all those blood-stained tools in the basement, and I shuddered. Mr. Welcome inhaled deeply, his massive, fleshy body ballooning. With a predatory roar, he ripped the chains out of the wall of the living building, orange pus and dark. Clotted blood dripped from the holes. The barn breathed faster and deeper, the broken walls vibrating and shimmering as new life and pain flowed into them. Mr. Welcome started moving towards us like a grinding juggernaut, walking on two legs like some sort of pig god. His many lidless eyes never looked away from us. The frayed optic nerves leading to the bell tower broke with a sound like snapping rubber bands. Dimitri looked at me with great sadness in his eyes. "Get away," he whispered. "I'll distract it. Just get Anna home, no matter what." Before I could respond, he ran forwards towards the abomination, the small, useless knife raised in one hand. Mr. Welcome saw him coming. He tried to swipe at Dimitri with a sharp, black hoof, but Dimitri ducked, running around the back of him. He gave a battle cry and started stabbing the monster in the back of the leg, which probably hurt it about as much as a toothpick, but it provided a distraction. This time, Mr. Welcome spun his whole body, falling back to all four legs to deal with this nuisance. He used his massive snout to smack Dimitri hard, sending him flying across the barn. He hit the wall with a bone-shattering thud. Dimitri's skin immediately started to blacken, as if he were being burned alive. His eyes melted out of his face as he screamed, clawing at the dying patches of necrotic tissue spreading across his body. Within a few seconds, his screams faded to agonized groans. He tried to crawl back towards us as he died. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Anna's hand and forcing her to sprint by my side. Philip was already one step ahead of us, frantically trying to reach the shelter of the forest. I heard the ground shake behind me as Mr. Welcome drew near, moving much faster than we could ever hope to go. I knew we would never make it. "Keep going, no matter what," I yelled at Philip and Anna. They kept running, the animal instinct to survive now foremost in their minds. I had to suppress mine. I turned to face the creature, the evil pig god known as Mr. Welcome. In hindsight, I don't know if God or some divine power had interceded, but the bare mace was probably one of the few items that could have saved us at that moment. Mr. Welcome had many eyes, and now that he was running on all four paws, his face was within reach. As my heart palpitated wildly, I raised the bare mace and sprayed at his dozen eyes. He didn't slow, and I had to jump to the side to keep from being trampled. The air whooshed past me as if a subway car had gone by. But a moment later, Mr. Welcome gave a roar, and not one of anger and hunger. This was a roar of pain and uncertainty. Blinded, Mr. Welcome frantically started running in circles, knocking down huge swathes of trees. The ear-splitting racket as he pulled the forest apart crashed over the surrounding landscape. Without a moment of hesitation, I turned to follow Philip and Anna back to the car. We told the police about the barn and all the hostages, but they claimed they couldn't find it, and we never heard anything more about it. Looking back on the experience, I now know why Chernobyl is a restricted zone, and it isn't just because of the radioactivity. There are some things that hide under the surface, after all, things that grow in the dark, rotted places where no eyes roam. Story 2. The Conduit. I hated being alone. I don't mean on my own. You can be on your own, but not alone, if you have a good enough distraction. A good book or film or a hobby that keeps your mind busy can make you feel like you're not alone. Being alone, at least for me, meant being unoccupied in my mind. I had taken up a few tinkering hobbies to help in this. Joinery, making cabinets and spice racks, or a birdhouse. Anything to help keep my mind busy, really. When my mind was left unoccupied, it allowed them to visit. I don't want to say I was a psychic, that's a bit too cliche, but I was more of a conduit for them. They were spirits, but they didn't come to give me a message or anything like that. But I did provide a service for them. Through me, they could essentially live again. When you pass, you gain things that you didn't have in life, such as foresight. This is how messages can be passed on from the spirit world. You also lose senses like touch, smell and taste. That's what I provided for them. They didn't possess me. I was in full control of my body and my senses, and anything I wasn't comfortable doing, I could refuse. Some of them were okay with this, a little disappointed perhaps, but ultimately okay with my decision. Others weren't as nice and could, and some did, inflict illnesses upon me, usually flu-like symptoms that passed after a day or two. The first time it happened weirded me out. I was in my 20s and just bought a motorbike. It was a sunny spring morning, and so donned in my leathers and helmet, I hit the country roads and headed to a coastal town in the north of England. I walked along the seafront, just taking in the sights and the sounds, when I had an urge to smell the sea air. Just stand there and take lungful after lungful of the salty air. Then when I noticed him, he was a tall man in a bespoke suit, wearing wire-thin spectacles and a type of bowler hat. He was sitting on a bench just staring at me. He looked not out of place but out of time, like I'd been transported back 100 years. The strangest thing was I knew him, even though I had never seen him before in my life. I knew everything about him. I knew his name, address, how old he was, where he worked and how he died. Interesting gift, he said to me, a look of puzzlement on his face. I sat down next to him. That I can see you? I asked him. I thought many people had that gift. He smiled at me. It was a warm and friendly smile. You don't know, do you? He was a very well-spoken man, and you could tell he was educated. From what I remember, he worked in financing, a banker or insurance. It's funny. In the moment, there isn't a detail I don't know, but afterwards it's like trying to peer through a dirty window on a foggy street. You get bits and pieces, but you almost have to guess at other parts. You're a conduit, he said in a matter-of-fact tone. The bloody hell's one of them, I asked, trying not to sound rude. He let out a small laugh. I've seen people here over my years, some glance and are gone, others sit and talk. Commune, if you will. These are the psychics. They ask things and pass on messages, X. Then there's you. You are a window for me back into your world. When you took those breaths of air, I could smell it, taste it, almost as if I were you for a second. You act as a conduit for me to access those senses again. I sat trying to process what he was saying. Would you do me a favor? he asked. His polite manner almost made him seem embarrassed to ask. "If I can," I replied, trying to sound cheery but also concerned, not too sure what I was letting myself in for. "Do you think we could get an ice cream? I've not had one in such a long time." I let out an audible laugh before realizing I was to everyone else talking and laughing to myself. After that realization, I quickly said yes and began to walk towards the ice cream parlor. The thing about ghosts and using you as a conduit is they don't get full. 8 ice creams later, and I was not feeling the best. After all the flavors he tried, his favorite was plain old Jane vanilla, which for some reason amused me. After leaving him back at the bench where we'd met, I headed back to my bike, and after throwing up, I headed home. The spirits didn't seek me out for this gift of mine, but if they were in my general vicinity, they did kind of home in on me. I was visiting a popular toy store one day, the one with the giraffe mascot, when I noticed a little girl sitting on a wall out the front, kicking her black patent leather shoes off the wall. She stopped dead and looked straight at me. "Hey, mister!"
Mister!
She began to shout, almost scream at me. To put this child in a category, it would be firmly in the brat category. Think Veruca Salt from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. She was rich, and she was entitled a dangerous combination at the best of times. She came from a household that was staffed, from a time when staff were little more than slaves. "How may I be of service?" I asked in an almost mocking tone. "You're one of them, aren't you?" She said it in a way that was almost accusing, derogative even, like I should be ashamed of my gift. This little girl stood before me. She was the prettiest little girl you ever saw. Her blonde curly hair was tied up, with bows in pigtails, and she had on a red and black, almost tartan designed dress. But don't let that fool you for a second. The devil himself resided within that little girl. Go in there and I want you to play with the dream house and the car and all the Barbie dolls you can find. It was almost comical to see her face pouted with her hands on hips. I was waiting for the foot tap to complete the look, but that part she missed off. "Yeah, sorry that ain't happening." I walked past her. She began to scream as she followed me around the store, my very own little bratty shopper. "I want to play." "Now play!" Forgetting who I was talking to and where I was talking to them, I turned. I'm not proud to say I chastised the little ghost girl, but that's what happened. I am a grown-ass man. If you think for 1 second that I am going to sit and play with a goddamn Barbie doll, then you are very much mistaken. You may have owned a lot when you were alive, but you are not my boss, and I do not, and will not take orders from a bratty little child. Now I suggest you use the time you have to learn some bloody manners. Apologize and then maybe I will consider helping you in some way, but if I sit down in a shop and play with dolls, I'll be locked up and signing a register before they even close the shop, so no, I will not play with a bloody doll. I had to cut that shopping trip short, and boy did she make me pay. I was holed up in bed for a week with a mysterious flu, and no amount of countertop drugs came close to even touching it. I later noticed a pattern which made me feel a little bad about my outburst. I wouldn't say I was completely bombarded by spirits, but I had a fair few. What I picked up on was when someone passed naturally, they were a lot more mild-mannered and polite. But if they were cut short and hadn't fulfilled their lives, they were bitter and obnoxious and just mean. Maybe it wasn't her fault she acted the way she did. Years had gone by since my first encounter with the man on the coast, and I had learnt how to live with my gift. Then I was visited by an elderly lady that broke me. I believe her name was Edith or Enid. It was short and started with an E. She was one of the only ones that visited me at my home. I was washing the pots and looked out of the kitchen window, and she was just sat there on the bench at the bottom of my garden. She was wearing a purple flowery sundress and holding a white handkerchief. I could sense her watching me. I slowly dried my hands, reached for my cup of tea on the side, made my excuse to my wife and headed out with my drink to get some air after an amazing dinner. Sitting down on the bench, the old lady began, "I'm very sorry to intrude on such a personal time, and you can tell me no, I'll understand." I sat listening as the lady explained what she wanted from me. It was a simple request, and I didn't think it would affect me as dramatically as it did. "I want a hug." That was it. I want a hug. I sat drinking my tea. I miss my grandkids and want to feel a child's embrace once more. I understand it's a very personal moment, the love shared between parent and child, and I will understand, but please, if I could just feel it once again, you would make an old lady very happy." She sat with a somber smile on her face as she fiddled with her handkerchief. It took me longer than I thought it would to answer. After all, it's just a hug, right? But she was right, that was my hug with my son. Was I being selfish, not wanting to share that? Then I thought about my grandma, and how I was at the other side of the country when she passed. I would have given everything I had to have one last hug off her. With that in mind, I agreed. She sat with us while we played. I bathed him and rubbed him down with the warmest, fluffiest towel we owned, while she sat smiling and watching. We played games, getting dressed, tickling and laughing. Then, before he settled down for the night, I dropped down to my knees and invited him in for a cuddle. The feeling of warmth flooded me as I squeezed him into my chest. In that moment, I never wanted to let him go. I wanted to stop time and stay in that warm embrace forever. The old lady thanked me as she left. The strangest feeling came over me, not dread or anything like that, but a horrible feeling all the same. I excused myself from the room, told my wife I felt a little off, and I was getting a shower to clear my head. As the warm water hit me, I collapsed into a ball, sobbing, as a feeling of great loss took over my body. It's hard to explain, I didn't know what. I just knew I'd lost something or someone, and it hurt. It made me feel sick as I lay in the shower, heaving great heavy sobs. I ached and longed for something and nothing. Things were quiet after that night. I didn't have any visitations for months. Just as I was beginning to feel like that awful feeling I'd had was maybe my gift, coming to an end, or worse, being passed on to my son through some sort of cuddle transference. I met him. For the first time since discovering my gift, I knew nothing about spirit before me. I knew he wasn't from our world, but unlike all the other spirits, that's all I knew. There was no name, no history, nothing. To say he was an Adonis of a man is an understatement. His height and build would intimidate the very best of us. His skin was bronzed to perfection, and there was not a blemish anywhere to be seen. His eyes were hard to gauge. Looking straight at him, they appeared a kind of greyish, but as he moved, the colour changed through blues and greens, as if they were iridescent in colour. He was definitely out of place in my garage. "Mr. Smith, I've heard many things about you," he began as he walked around my garage, heading towards me. "Do I know you?" I asked, not sure if the meeting was a pleasant one or going to turn out bad on my end. "People are referring to you as the conduit," he continued, ignoring my question. "I'd like to show you something if you'd permit me. It's not something everyone gets to see, but I feel you could be beneficial." I took my time to answer, running the words over in my head, trying to figure out if there was a pitfall I was about to stumble into. The situation was so hard to read. The air was totally neutral. No panic or fear, but also no love or compassion. Just two men and their words. Words that seemed to fall from the air as soon as they were spoken. "What would you like to show me?" I asked, even though I had tried to put something into my voice, curiosity. At the very least, my words sounded flat and dull. "It's not so much a what as a where, if you'd please follow me." Without speaking, I just slowly nodded my head. I don't remember the journey, I just remember arriving at what appeared to be a generic sort of diner in the middle of nowhere. There was a cream wall with a red brick pattern surrounding the building, and a weird fog that just kind of hung in the air. We walked into the building and the feeling was sort of melancholic. Sad, but a happy sad. The decor reminded me of the type of roadside diners you'd see in the American movies. Beige and cream with red checkered design around the walls, a jukebox playing 50s rock and roll in the corner, booths on the outside table and chairs filling the center of the room. A Long Island bar ran around the service area, acting as more seating and table space. The place was filled with people meeting loved ones and talking over a cup of tea or coffee. People always came in, but I never saw anyone leave there, just always seemed to a seat for them, and some loved one waiting. I got the impression that this was some kind of meeting point, or a waiting room of sorts. We sat down in a corner booth, and I just observed the people coming in and being reunited with friends and family. After a while, the man spoke. "You have a truly wonderful gift, you know. You can bring joy and comfort to people that have forgotten or don't realize they're missing it. We do try to make things familiar, but we can't replicate what we don't remember. But you You can make that hot chocolate taste just like Grandma used to make it. You can give that comfort and joy. It wouldn't be permanent, just visit now and then. I looked around again. That melancholic feeling I felt when I first walked in had lifted slightly, and a warmth had started coming through. I decided to visit a few times a week to help what I believed to be people passing over. The man wasn't always there, but when he was, he would sit with me and we would talk. I don't remember much of our chats, but one stuck out. One I did remember, and it made me feel like there was a hidden agenda to my needs in the diner. Do you know what every civilization has in common? The man looked up from his coffee as he asked the question, what every civilization that has ever existed have all done. What they have all created. I took a sip of my coffee and thought about the question, war? I responded, causing him to laugh. War, that's a good one, and technically yes, but no, that's not what I'm thinking of. No, every civilization that has ever existed has created religion, a god, a deity, someone or something to point at and thank or curse depending on how things are going. Over time, civilizations have come and gone, their gods have changed, and they too have come and gone, but every civilization always finds a religious relief. There's going to be changes happening, and as in the past, a new god, a new deity will be formed. And as also happened in the past, this new deity, this new god will be challenged, will be fought against, but their word must prevail. I sat in my chair, not sure how to respond. Why are you telling me this? I am no messenger, no messiah. I'm a middle-aged man from the north of England. If I start claiming to be the second coming of Christ, they'll lock me up. The man looked back at me, his smile was different. It looked friendly enough, but underneath it had a new meaning. We're not asking you to be a messiah. This is just a chat. You've already played your part in what's to come. Mr. Smith, a friendly word of advice. People who go against the grain often find themselves wandering the field. I looked at him confused. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, but I'll take your word for it. His smile faltered slightly as he leaned in. Come for a walk with me. I'd like to show you something else. We left the diner and headed out into the street. The light seemed darker and the mist a little thicker. We followed the cream and red wall around the outside of the diner. There were several plastic crates stacked up in a corner. He walked over and grabbed two, placing them at the base of the wall. Have a look, he said, gesturing to the second crate. Gingerly, I stepped up and peered over the wall. A feeling of dread washed over me as the landscape revealed itself. A large field stretched out in every direction, trees and shrubs were dotted about. I could make out the silhouettes of people walking around lost and scared. But there was something else. Something unseen lurked in the shadows, used the trees and shrubs as cover as it waited to strike. I couldn't see anything, but as with the spirits, I knew it was there watching, waiting. After seeing all I could stomach, I stepped down from the crate feeling shaken and confused, like I'd actually been one of the poor souls in the field. I trust you'll do what's right, Mr. Smith, when the time comes. I tried to avoid going after that, but I somehow got dragged back in. I would have spirits come and take me, even when I told them no. It was no longer my choice. I was now theirs, and they wanted me all the time. One day, while I was sat watching and drinking my coffee, as I always did, I noticed an old man sat watching me. He wasn't very tall, but the thing that stood out the most was his crazy hair. After some time of us looking at each other and nodding hello and awkwardly smiling, I couldn't help but notice he didn't have a visitor. I left my corner booth and made my way over to him. He was a very pleasant man and a very intelligent man. We talked for some time about everything and anything. Before I left, he asked me if I liked coming here still. I explained what had happened on my previous visit. My boy, he said, if you don't want to come, then don't. All you have to do is tune out. What do you mean, tune out? I asked. Think of your head like a radio. It picks up frequencies and plays them. If you don't like what's playing on the radio, you change the frequency. So if you don't like what's playing, my boy, just change the frequency. And how do I do that? For that you must find the dial, but alas, I cannot show that to you, for I do not know where it is. Another technique you could try is cancelling out the white noise. Have you ever been so busy that the whole world passes you by and you don't even notice it? Occupy the mind and you distract the senses. So that's what I did for the next however many years. I worked I got hobbies. I cooked. I created things in my garage. Anything to occupy my mind. Then today, I was sitting in my garden finishing off the last few coats of paint on the go-kart I had made for my grandson, when I heard his cheery voice coming round the corner. "Hey, Gramps," he shouted over as he made his way down the side of the house towards me. I stood up to look at him and wave. Seeing he was alone in, shouted over, "Who were you talking with, Peter?" He started laughing and looked up to his side, shaking his head. "He's silly, isn't he?" He said to no one, "It's your friend Enid Silly." My blood ran cold as the realization set in as to what the man meant. I'd already played my part. He meant my bloodline. Story 3. Listen to your fear in the wild, even if you don't understand why you're afraid. It was Mackenzie's idea to go camping. In fact, most things we do start out as one of her ideas. Neither of us were exactly outdoor enthusiasts, but we had both grown up in rural towns and did our share of hiking and fishing growing up. So I wasn't exactly daunted by the idea of spending a few days in the woods. But I wasn't excited either. School has just let out for spring break, and after another semester of getting kicked by midterms, it was very tempting to give in to my body's desire for a few days of uninterrupted sleep. Uninterrupted sleep, unfortunately, was not Mackenzie's idea of a good time. She had been suggesting the idea to me for weeks beforehand, and I had always brushed her off by claiming I had other things coming up. But by the time the break rolled around, I had run out of excuses, and she had already prepared everything with me in mind, so it was decided. We left on Sunday, despite Mackenzie making me wake up before the sun even rose to get on the road. I found myself in a strangely good mood. I had spent most of the previous day either eating or napping, the most uninterrupted rest I had gotten since Christmas. We drove up from Bakersfield, her truck bathed in the light of the desert sunrise. At first we spoke of classes and tests, and then of a camping spot that she had found in the forests of the Sierra Nevada. It wasn't actually a campground, she informed me. It was something called dispersed camping, which means you register a permit with park services and then you pitch a tent wherever you like, which also meant no water, heat, or electricity. Leave it to Mackenzie to make sure everything we do is to the extreme. By the time the desert scenery had bled into the browns and greens of the Sierra foothills, I had rifled through all of our packs. I trusted Mackenzie with the planning, but now that I realize we were going to be a little more off the grid than previously anticipated, I just wanted to make sure. We each had our own private tents and sleeping bags, along with a few days' supply of food and water, cooking utensils, first aid kits, and other items were divided up between our two packs, which were already stacked high enough to peek over my head when it was on my back. I recognized landmarks near Sequoia National Park and Kings Canyon, but Mackenzie took us farther north and I lost track of the terrain. She turned on a trail that led us deeper into the mountains and pulled over when it ended at the foot of a hill. "I was out here last week looking around for spots," she said, opening the car door. "If we hike around this hill here, there's a sort of little valley with a lake at the bottom where we can set up." I groaned a little as I shrugged on my pack. "How long a hike?" I asked. I took a step forward and winced at the sound of pots clanging together. "Next time I'm packing my own bag. Maybe half an hour or so. A little cardio never hurt anyone, I guess." And I bumped the pack higher before tightening the hip strap, trying to keep the weight from dragging on my shoulders. Mackenzie was right. Just around the hill, the terrain dropped dramatically towards a lake at the center of the valley, almost like a caldera. I just doubt that there used to be any active volcanoes around these parts. Mackenzie led the way down, through some steep ground where I was worried I might slip and roll all the way down into the lake. But the firm dirt made good footing, and the trees made good handholds. Mackenzie suddenly stopped. I heard the rushing of water. I peeked around her shoulder and saw that in front of us laid a stream, almost a small river if I was being generous. It also led towards the lake, but a bend in the trail meant we had to cross it to continue. The snows up in the mountains must have begun to melt, because the stream had swelled in size, and the log that laid across it was already submerged by a thin layer of water. Only a few more minutes of walking after we crossed this, Mackenzie said, nudging the log with the toe of her boot. It seemed sound enough, despite being underwater. I'd watched out, I said, leaning over the stream. There were tiny ripples at the surface, but it looked placid. They say that streams like these only look calm on the surface. Mackenzie snorted out a laugh and stepped onto the log. Yeah, that's why I don't plan on swimming in it. She began to shimmy across, and after a few moments I shrugged and joined her. It wasn't a far crossing, maybe 20 feet, and we were making fast progress. But in the end it was always the little things that got you. A little more than halfway across, Mackenzie's foot slipped, and she leaned forward to regain her balance. Her sleeping bag, tied to the top of the pack, broke loose from one of its straps, fell forward over her shoulder until it was caught mid-air by the remaining strap. That little momentum was enough. Mackenzie tottered for a split second, and then fell. I was right. The current was fast. She reached out a hand to grab onto the log, but by the time she resurfaced, she was already too far downstream. I began to scramble across, in hopes of getting to the other side before she was pulled too far away. I guess some luck was on our side that day. The stream was fast, but it wasn't deep, and it couldn't pull her under. Some 20 yards downstream, her pack had caught onto a fallen tree, and that was how I found her. Gasping and sputtering, maybe it was a combination of the adrenaline and the ice-cold water, but by the time we stumbled to the spot where we were going to set up camp, Mackenzie was laughing hysterically. She had rolled her ankle during her stint in the stream and was limping on ahead of me while I stumbled after her with her pack, in addition to mine, strapped to me. I don't plan on swimming in it. Mackenzie giggled from ahead of me, and then I fell right into the damn thing. Even I had to smile at that, despite being stuck with around 60 pounds of supplies. Maybe I did need some more action in my life. Now I really had a story to tell when I got back home. It was just about noon by the time we finished pitching our tents and hung our wet clothes out to dry. Mackenzie began digging a fire pit to cook our lunch, as we had neglected to bring a jet boiler. I took this moment to take stock of my surroundings and was pleasantly surprised that we found a genuinely beautiful spot to set up camp. We were by the edge of the lake, where the mountains flattened out and the tree line ended a few yards from the shore. After being in school dorms for nearly a year, the amount of the quiet was almost uncanny, the only sounds being the wind in the trees and the waves breaking against the sand. It was alluring, like a lullaby. Mackenzie cussed beside me. I looked over. She was struggling to get the fire going. Her hands shook as she tried to light another match. A small pile of used ones already lay by her knee. "Let me try," I said, sitting up. "She almost got pulled away by a stream an hour ago," I reasoned. "Sometimes the shock only hits you after the adrenaline has gone away." I had more luck, and after the fire got going, the rest of the afternoon and evening went by pleasantly. I rummaged through my pack and found that Mackenzie had packed marshmallows and chocolate for s'mores. I tossed the packaging on the ground and jokingly said, "I see my pack was so heavy because it was full of all these essential supplies." Mackenzie grinned and then shrugged innocently. She grabbed the package of marshmallows and began unceremoniously shoving them into her mouth. "Aren't those for cooking?" I asked, and Mackenzie looked up at me with a very well-acted look of confusion. I laughed. When the sun set, both of us agreed to retire early so we could wake up at sunrise to explore the area in the morning. I shimmied into my tent and pulled the zipper closed. I checked my watch one last time before letting the sound of waves lull me to sleep. I woke up in the dark, and something was wrong. The air was heavy and my skin was clammy as if I had just broken a fever. Nothing was disturbed inside my tent, and the outside was still quiet. There was nothing reasonable that could have caused this feeling. It's hard to explain. Thinking back on it, the only conclusion I could come to is that we, as a species, are old. Younger than the forests and mountains, of course, but still old enough. And in that time we have seen many things. You can conjure up your life experiences and logic all you want, but deep down, there is a part of you that simply knows when something is wrong. And in that moment I knew. Suddenly, There was a light tapping on the flap of my tent, and then a voice. "You need to come outside," Mackenzie whispered, and she sounded terrified. I took a few deep breaths and clenched my pocket knife in a white knuckle grip. In a flurry of motion, I unzipped the flap and stuck my face outside. I came face to face with Mackenzie. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked to be on the verge of tears. I opened my mouth, but she clamped a hand down over my lips and motioned for me to be silent. For a few moments, neither of us spoke, and the only sound to be heard was our heavy breathing as we stared at each other. But then Mackenzie's eyes slowly drifted away from mine, towards the lake. I saw her pupils dilate until I could barely see the color of her eyes. "Run," she whispered. I didn't have time to question her. She leapt up and sprinted into the woods. I didn't waste a second before getting up and following her. The two of us crashed through the undergrowth. Perhaps Mackenzie was clearing the way in front of me because it was strangely easy. Maybe I was simply scared. "Mackenzie!" I called to the shape in front of me, but no answer. Only the sound of her breathing and the cracking of branches. "Mackenzie." "What's going on?" Still nothing. And then the adrenaline in my system began to run out, and suddenly I stopped. It was dark, almost too dark to see. We had left all our lanterns back at the camp, and the canopy practically blocked out any moonlight. We'd been running for several minutes, but there were no cuts on me or branches clinging to my hair. It was like I hadn't been forcing my way through the trees at all. It was as if they were welcoming me. Ahead of me, Mackenzie had stopped too. She was standing still, and I couldn't hear her breaths anymore. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice strangely level. "Not until you tell me what's going," I called back. Mackenzie shook her head. It was even darker where she was standing, and I couldn't make out her face, but behind her was some sort of clearing, and the light coming through silhouetted her against the trees. "We're almost of the forest," she said, and I saw that she was right. There was nothing I would not give to be out of this god-forsaken forest. But no, it couldn't be. It took us half an hour to hike here, and that was downhill. The forest could not end here. I was being reeled in, like a fish chasing a worm on a hook. Mackenzie turned around, and as she did, she took a step towards me, an impossibly huge step. She had been several yards ahead, and now we were almost face to face. I ran. I turned around and I ran like I was being chased by the devil himself. If the trees had been welcoming on the way in, they were the opposite on the way out. Branches caught on my clothes and cut my arms and face. I kept on stumbling over tree roots and rocks, but I was undeterred. Behind me, I heard her running after me, but it didn't sound like Mackenzie any longer. It sounded like it had four legs. I wasn't even tempted to turn around. I was too focused on running, and my eyes stayed locked on the light that marked the end of the tree line. I practically dove onto the beach and fell hard onto my hands and knees. I felt the bones in my wrist crunch at the landing. I continued to crawl until I was almost in the water before I turned around. There was nothing there. I wasn't far from our tents, and I watched in wonder as Mackenzie's tent unzipped from the inside and she stepped out. "What are you doing?" she asked groggily. I ran towards her and practically tackled her into a hug. It was thanks to Mackenzie that we both didn't fall, because in that moment my knees gave out. "There's something in the forest," I said, and to her credit, she immediately grew serious. "Did you see someone?" she asked, scanning the dark line of trees looming over us. "No," I said. "Well, yes, but I don't know." And at that moment I didn't want to tell her what I saw, because speaking of it makes it all the more real. "Something tried to lure me into the forest," I said at length, "but I don't think it's human." Mackenzie just stared at me. For a split second I thought she was going to call me insane, but it never came. "We need to get to the truck," she said. If she had any questions, she refrained from asking them. "No," I replied, regaining some of my composure. "It wants us in the forest." "We're as good as in the forest right now," Mackenzie reasoned. "The truck is right there. We need to leave." I looked up, and I could see the glint of the truck in the moonlight at the top of the hill. It seemed so close. I outran it once. We could do it again, and there'll be two of us this time. Once we're there, we'll drive, and we won't stop until this freak show is hours behind us. We could be in Bakersfield by morning. But no, we couldn't, because the truck is more than a mile away, tucked away behind some hill. We shouldn't be able to see it from here. It was simply impossible. Whatever it was a good hunter, I admit, because good hunters don't chase you with drums and torches. They come at night and they come quietly, disguised as everything you could want. When you are in the dark, they are a light. When you are trapped, they are escape. And when you are lonely, they are company. I pushed Mackenzie away. "Why didn't you wake up when I ran into the forest?" I asked. She shrugged, and her facial expression clearly showed that she thought I was being an idiot. "You were quiet," she replied. "But you heard me when I came back." She looked me in the eyes. "I guess you were louder." There was a tense moment between us where no one spoke. Then Mackenzie threw her hands into the air in exasperation. "What use is this?" she shouted. "We need to leave." I shook my head and took a step back. "No," I said. "I'm staying here." She looked at me like I had finally gone insane, but I wouldn't budge. Mackenzie took a step toward me, and I flipped my pocket knife open and pointed it at her. She stopped in her tracks and stared at me. You couldn't say she looked surprised. "So, it's going to be like this, huh?" I nodded, and the two of us lapsed into yet another silence. After a while, she sat and I followed suit. She talked to me all night. At first, she tried to convince me that we needed to leave. She begged me, in fact. She talked about how close the truck was and how dangerous it was to be out here. Then as the night dragged on, she spoke of stranger things. She asked me if I was tired, and I didn't reply. "You never have to be tired again," she said. "I don't just mean tonight. What will you do once you leave? Go back to your life? Work? You will be tired for the rest of your life. You will die tired." She made a sweeping gesture with her hand that encompassed the expanse of trees behind her. "You can stay here forever," she said. "I promise you will never be tired again." When I didn't answer, she began to speak of her sisters. I knew for a fact that Mackenzie had no sisters. She talked about how they would gather berries for me and how they would make me a crown of oak leaves to wear. She told me that they stitched clothes with no seams and made fabrics from the foam of the sea. I was in a trance. She painted pictures in my mind of how they would fashion me flutes and harps, and how we would go dancing through the forests during winter, leaving behind only footprints in the snow. "When you sing," she said, smiling, "the snows will melt and you will bring in the first flowers of spring." And even so, I did not move and I did not sleep. Finally, just before the dawn broke, Mackenzie stood. "So this is it." And her voice didn't even sound like Mackenzie's anymore. "A marvelous hunt comes to an end." And she bent at the waist in a mock bow before turning around and walking into the woods. "You may leave." She laughed over her shoulder as she melted into the shadows. And her laugh echoed across the valley, making ripples in the water and shaking the trees like the wind. I didn't trust her. I waited until the sun was high in the sky before leaving everything but my knife, and I ran for it. I encountered nothing in the forest on the way back, but I also didn't stop to look. By the time I reached the truck, my legs were burning and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I am not lying when I say I did not touch the brake pedal even once driving out of those mountains. I never looked behind me either, but the trees casted shadows on the ground as I passed them. And just before I reached the edges of foothills, I swore I saw one in the shape of a woman, and I saw it waving. I called park services at the nearest town and gave them a polished version of what happened. They searched the area and found Mackenzie's body face down in the lake, carried there by the current. I don't know what I pulled out of that stream, but it wasn't her. It might sound twisted, but I was relieved to hear the news. I had thought that maybe Mackenzie had never been there with me, that it had planned this whole trip from start to finish. I'm still in shock, but I will mourn for my friend when the time comes. I saw the stream, I knew how shallow it was. Mackenzie should not have died, but it killed her. It murdered her, and it would have murdered me. So as beautiful as its words sounded, I did not stay. It has no power outside. It lives in the forests. I will say it again. It lives in the forests, and when you see it, you will know. Story 4. If you are depressed, avoid dark places. You won't like what is waiting for you there. It's been some time before I had gotten a chance to go back home. I went to Canada for my university and am currently looking for work. The economy was down the shitter. My friends from uni all dispersed into their own adult lives, and I was stuck, alone in my apartment, staring at a dwindling list of relevant job offers online. I'd started staying up later and later, where the first sunlight was usually also the last natural light I would see before crashing on my couch. I was at my limit, not enjoying much of anything, and all my senses feeling numb. I was just pushing on through to the next day. I'd decided to save up some money to return back to my family for a short while, just a few weeks to decompress and see if that would help me. I come from one of the smaller cities in Midwestern Germany. There's absolutely nothing notable about it other than being located near the forest where my ancestors fought back the Romans. But the people are nice, as far as Germans go. We are a weird people, I admit, outwardly cold towards those we don't know, until we get together for a few beers or a piece of cake, after which you would think we were friends our entire lives. But that's exactly what I wanted then. If I managed to get out of my hole to grab a coffee, those trained smiles just reminded me of how miserable I was. I needed the gruffness of my fatherland and the reality of my own family. My arrival in the first few days went about as well as I'd anticipated. I was greeted with hugs and kisses and had to tell the same stories about 100 times before crashing on my old bed. Even at home, I barely managed to get outside. I'd stay up, smoke and drink on the balcony before letting sleep carry me through the day. My family was understandably worried. I hadn't really told them the extent of how shitty I had been feeling. They tried their best, considering they didn't really know how to deal with my mental status. It wasn't their fault. Their words weren't reaching me. At least, they managed to figure out pretty quickly to drop the subject for now, attempting instead to simply cheer me up by being themselves and acting as if everything was normal. It worked for me, even if it wasn't quite the reality check I needed. I even managed to get up early enough to see them at breakfast. I still remember the soft smiles they gave me when they saw me. I shrugged, sat down, and ate some eggs. One day, an old high school friend, Max, who had also managed to make his way back home and had heard of my arrival, hit me up via text and asked if I wanted to go on a walk. I wanted to decline, but at the same time, I felt bad enough that I had never once texted him, and now here he was, inviting me. We used to live close together, so all he needed to do was pick me up at home. We decided to retread our old childhood stomping grounds in the forest that bordered our suburb. It's the same forest I mentioned earlier. By the way, as he rang the doorbell, I was overcome by this terrible anxiety. How would he see me? What would he think of me? I opened the door and he immediately smiled and said, "How are you, you fucking ghost?" I couldn't help but grin and we hugged. "Could be better. Bro, you know how it is," I replied. "Ain't that the truth?" He chuckled and beckoned me outside. I will be paraphrasing some of what was said as I'm translating it. Otherwise, I would just sound off. As we hiked through the downtrodden dirt paths, through the luscious trees, bright green and alight with the sounds of birds chirping away, we barely said a word to each other. I guess he understood what I was going through, perhaps heard the bare minimum from whoever told him I was even here. At the time, I thought he pitied me, and that's why he came to pick me up. We exchanged the odd question about what we were doing. For me, nothing. He was training to become a nurse, which honestly surprised me, seeing as he always was more one for making jokes and sleeping in class rather than being passionate about helping people. But who was I to judge? We decided to walk up the hill further into the woods. unlike the miles and miles of dark green conifers you might be picturing from North America. This forest is more of a mixture of beeches, birches, and fir trees. Most areas are well lit, as the sun has enough space to seep through. However, I've always felt it gives you a false sense of security. You think you can see everything, but in the end, it is still you, alone in the woods, dismissing every shadow or sign of movement as leaves and branches, when in reality, you really have no idea what might be lurking behind those tree trunks. Another aspect is that while the paths seem to form a natural clearing, it is just as easy to get lost, mistaking a more flat patch on the ground for a man-made path, just because the leaves don't obscure the sun, letting the forest swallow you up with ease. I realized then that I'd never been aware of that until now. I've always seen the woods as our kingdom, as nature inviting us to be free and just be children. Something wrong? Max asked. Forest seems different. Might just be me, though. Max nodded and replied, I get what you mean. Seems less friendly now that we're older, doesn't it? Exactly. Max stopped for a second and frowned, before suggesting, listen, one thing is actually different. You remember the meadow, with the river and the bridge? Sure. You recall that concrete bunker that was next to it? We always just thought it was something to do with the power grid. I did remember it. I remembered the way it stood out as an ugly minimalist block, threatening the serenity of nature. The graffiti didn't help. We would usually stay away, not minding it. I nodded. Well, that one is gone, but there's another one. Popped up a while ago. Don't know when exactly. Lisa's aunt noticed it while walking her dog. Want to check it out? I raised my eyebrow. Why would we want to do that? I don't know, man. I'm trying my best here. I could sense his desperation, reminding me of my parents, seeing me every night before they went to bed, asking me to hang out with them. I shrugged, grabbed his shoulders, and said, lead the way then. He gave me a weak smile and we walked on. Indeed, the structure was, in terms of how it was built, identical to the one we saw as kids. We walked around it, checking every angle. There really was nothing remarkable about it, but something was finally stirring inside my cold heart. A sense of adventure, something new and unexpected to be discovered. I didn't know how long it would last, but I wanted to cling onto it and keep it inside me for as long as I could. We found a door on one side, reading no authorized access. Max poked me and asked, is it just me, or does this door look different from the old one? It did. There's a handle on this one and no lock. The old one just had a keyhole. I suppose it was so it was harder to open from the outside. I looked around, trying to get a better lay of the land. Have you noticed something else? Max tried to follow my eyes. What? There are no power lines or towers. The old one had those too. Maybe it's underground. Save the trees and all of that. Maybe, I responded. Max took another walk around the box, shouting from the other side. Nobody has tagged it yet. Either. Can't be that old then. Come back and give me a lift. Max helped me onto the roof. There was nothing. Not even an HVAC box. Bro, what do you see? Nothing. Max, not a thing. I jumped back down and looked at my friend. We both started to grin. This little detour had just turned into a bona fide mystery. I guess there's only one thing to do now, I said, looking at the door handle. I guess you're right. We both didn't move a muscle, exchanging glances. Max took a step back, holding his hands up. Why don't you go ahead? Wimp. Do it then, big guy. All right. I slowly placed my hands on the handle, as if it may be electrified, and tried twisting it. Nothing happened. I could feel Max deflate behind me, but I wouldn't give up. I tried it with some more force and noticed the door buckle. I wouldn't stop now. I was feeling good. I kept pushing and pulling, using my foot against the wall for more force. Finally, the door gave way, and with it, I fell backward, crashing into leaves and dirt. Max was equally shocked and amused. Okay then, big guy, you go to the gym? Not really. The door must have just rusted shut, I said as I got back up and dusted myself off. We both took a look inside but couldn't see anything. But it was more than that. There was a thick wall of darkness just past the precipice of the doorway. No light from the forest dared to enter it. Even the birds seemed frightened, enveloping both of us in absolute silence. We tried to make anything out inside, but we couldn't. It was just black. I got out my phone and turned on the flashlight. Shining it inside, it barely managed to penetrate, forcing me to get closer and closer. It felt a chill come from this portal I had just opened up. Nah, man, this ain't right, Max huffed behind me. Just give me a second. I got as close to the opening as I was comfortable with and held my phone out. My fingers brushed past the boundary, and it was running them under icy cold water. I shuddered but tried to steady my arm. I can make out a hallway. That's it. I think it splits just a bit further in, I told Max. Cool. You want to lead the way then? You brought me here. Why don't you go first? I opened the damn thing. Exactly, finders keepers. Aren't nurses supposed to be able to be brave or something? First of all, nurse in training. Second of all, you're thinking of firefighters. And thirdly, what the fuck do you mean brave? It's like staring into the Marianas Trench. This doesn't seem natural. I mean, it's not. Somebody built it. Yeah, that somebody clearly doesn't want anybody to enter. I got agitated. He had brought me here. He agreed to open the door. Why did he want to ruin this for me? Isn't this what he wanted? Isn't this what everybody at home wants for me? To finally fucking act and not just waste away in my room? You can stand guard, I replied gruffly. Max put his hands in the air, took another look at me, and said, "You owe me a drink after this," before taking out his phone and turning the flashlight on. I felt my anger vanish, and we proceeded inside. We were definitely not dressed warm enough. As soon as both of us passed through the doorway, we took one last look at the forest behind us. There was nobody there to save us. We were alone. Maybe I shouldn't make Max do this. He was right. Something was very wrong here. I could feel my heartbeat fastening and my confidence replaced with fear. Max took the first step forward and said, "At least the door won't suddenly close on us." "I suppose so," I replied, following after him, hyping myself up. I wanted this. I needed this. I kept thinking to myself. The first few meters were easy, as long as the light and escape were still clearly behind us. But we both felt it. There was a pressure here, and the further we went in, the more it told us to leave. We made it towards the end, and indeed there was a split. "Which way, boss?" Max asked. I paused, shining my light in both directions. It looked to be more of the same. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked Max. Max gave me an agitated look and sighed. "You wanted this, right? And I don't abandon my friends." His words stung. I looked at my feet in embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I didn't text or call." I could make out his smile, and he replied, slapping my back, "It's all right. Bro, I get it. Gotta make up for lost time now, at least." "Yeah," I responded weakly. "So which way?" "No idea. Got a preference?" "Well, the left is one shade of pitch black, and the right is another shade. I'll pick right. Always my favorite side." "Right. It is," I proclaimed. We walked on, leaving the safety of the front door only in our memories. Slowly inching forward, our flashlights barely made a dent into the void. There was no glass, no doors, just concrete and the linoleum floor. After a little while, Max tapped on my back. "Hey, did you notice something?" I stopped. "No. What's up?" This whole box wasn't more than a few meters wide, right? It did take me like 2 or 3 steps to get around. "Well," he held his arms up. "How long have we been walking in here?" "Exactly. How the fuck is that possible?" "Isn't it Not only did this structure come out of nowhere, it also had complete disregard for the laws of physics. First, the light, which we simply waved away, but now this. I was beginning to wonder whether this was worth it. After all, torn between my need for excitement and a basic fear of the unknown. As if to answer us, our flashlights made out an irregularity ahead of us. It was another door. We made our way closer to the door, and Max slowly tried out the handle. The door opened into more black nothingness, where this time our light managed to illuminate even less. Max took another step, and suddenly he was gone. I blinked for a second, only to hear him scream and hear his voice draw further and further away from me. Running towards the doorframe, I only caught a glimpse of a bright dot falling further and further into an abyss we both had failed to see.
Max!
I called out to him several times, but he was nowhere to be seen. Even his flashlight had been swallowed up. I continued shouting out his name, but there was no response. I was suddenly very alone, very scared, and very much ashamed. Max was down there because of me, because I craved adventure so much in my boring, unfulfilled existence that I was willing to not only risk my life, but his as well. We both looked inside this alien box and knew something was wrong, yet I decided to go in anyway. Even if it wasn't dangerous, it was likely still very illegal. I've destroyed public property, entered a sealed-off area, and made my friend an accessory to my crime, a friend who had just been swallowed up by what looked to be a night sky without stars, utterly devoid of life. Then I heard it. It was a faint moan, barely audible but coming from below. I peeked my head past the doorway, again shouting, "Max, are you there?" The only response was more moaning. I grabbed my phone and tried to find anything to guide me. It couldn't just be a giant hole, could it? I nearly dropped my phone. The more desperately I tried to make something out. There was a little overhang just past the doorway. I got on all fours and crawled forward, shining my flashlight around me. Max's moans didn't cease. "Don't worry. Bro, I'm gonna come get you." I didn't really believe in the words I was saying. That wasn't until I noticed something in the overhang, just to my left. It went down, but when I looked closely, I saw that the drop was only a few centimeters. I slithered to my left and tried to follow the small drop. Indeed, just past the first one followed another similar decrease. Steps! They were hard to make out, seeing as the floor was as black as its surroundings, but the texture was different. They didn't particularly leave a lot of room to actually stand on, explaining why Max had so easily stumbled past them into the opening. If I was careful enough, I could manage my way down. So, I stood up and took my first few steps deeper into the void. My flashlight as my only companion, every move felt like a gamble. Would I reach the next step, stumble, or completely lose my balance and fall into the hole? I made damn sure to hug the wall. Clearly grooved. It must have been a circle, and a massive one at that. While I couldn't make out the door where I came from, I noticed quickly that it took a lot longer to traverse this staircase than I'd imagined. One more step and suddenly, I fell. I either missed a step or there was none. Everything looked the same, like nothing. I almost felt weightless, like drifting through the cosmos. There was no sound and almost no draft of air resisting my falling body, if not for my apparent ability to breathe and scream. You could be fooled into thinking this whole structure was housing a dark vacuum, ready to swallow any outside life into its empty space. I screamed and screamed as I fell, but the longer I dropped, the less energy I had to scream, flailing around in desperation. I tried to reach around me in the hopes of grasping a ledge, even if it would rip my arms out of their sockets. No luck. I just kept falling down that impossibly deep hole. All I kept thinking was, how could have Max survived the fall? Did I mistake his death screams echoing out as pained groans? But I would soon get my answer. Trying to think back to it, the fall must have taken about 5 minutes, more or less. That kind of distance in the real world would likely see you ending up as a pancake. But in this madhouse, a fall like that simply ended up with a broken phone and you lying on damp concrete, disoriented and sore from a somewhat rough landing. No doubt, my impact still hurt, but I was alive. I tried to sit up. My head was pounding, and I could feel the scrapes all over my body. I stumbled around in the darkness, stumbling over what I felt to be my broken phone. Turning around was like turning in a corn maze. Max!
Max!
I shouted. If he was still alive, he must be able to hear me, right? Julian. I heard Max's voice somewhere from my right. I'm here, over here. His voice sounded weak and scared. Quickly. I'm coming.
Bro!
I slowly made my way towards the direction his voice came from until I eventually fell over something. Ouch. What the fuck? Max cried out in pain. I scrambled and finally, my hands made their way to his shoulder. I couldn't help but give him a hug. I decided not to say it. Bro, I'm hurt. Get off me already. He groaned at me. How long did you fall for? I asked, just to ascertain whether I was making something up. A few good minutes. Honestly don't know how I survived, but I landed on my fucking ankle. It's done for. Justin. Let me help you. I reached around him and helped him up. Now what? He asked. I couldn't see him. The darkness was too powerful, even more suffocating down here, but it felt good to hold him, know somebody was there. I tried to force a chuckle and said, original exit is not an option anymore. I don't know why, but I could feel Max staring daggers at me. He sighed and said, let's walk in one direction, find a wall, and walk around. Like in a maze. What? The best way to escape a maze is to pick a wall and stick to it. No matter what, sooner or later, you will find an exit. I explained. Makes sense. Where did you hear that? Internet. Spent a lot of time there. I figured, he said almost wistfully. What does the internet say about impossible, fucking black hellscapes? Don't go in. I fucking hate you, Max said. Something dropped in my stomach, that feeling of having disappointed someone you hold dearly. I asked, do you mean that? Max snorted and responded, depends on if we make it out of here, buddy. We walked and walked. Max's phone also broke, so we had to just commit to a direction and hope for the best. We kept going strong, but soon both our bodies became weary. We became thirsty and hungry, and our bruised selves were starting to slow down. Every moment we were hoping to just run into a wall and break our noses, shouting in pain and joy, but that stop never came. We barely said a word to each other, just holding out our arms around us. I was the first to break down, almost taking Max along with me on my way to my knees. I couldn't help but start sobbing. There was a constant back and forth in my head, as my mind raced from each moment I fucked up and what I should have done better. Never should have entered the building. Never should have forced Max to come with me. Should have run out and asked for help when he fell. I should have never come back. A dark thought passed through. If I had died in Canada, my parents wouldn't have known of it for some time, staying blissfully ignorant and happy, thinking that their son was trying their best. If I were to disappear in these woods, in this hole, it wouldn't take them as long. Their devastation, sorrow, and grief would come much quicker. Again, when I think about it now, it seems like such a strange line of reasoning, but in the end, I know now as I did then what my mind was trying to tell me. You fucked up. Max tried to console me. Don't worry, we're going to make it. Other people have seen this place. Maybe somebody will come and find us. I'm sorry, was all I could get out. I know, buddy. This time Max held me, and so we just remained there for a bit, hugging it out, trying to get some relief out of our situation. We would venture onwards, the reality dawning on us that the bottom of this hole was larger than we could have imagined. At some point, we couldn't take it anymore, exhausted. We decided to take a break and sat down. Max took his jacket, bundled it up, and used it as a pillow to raise his ankle. I couldn't help but look around, knowing I wouldn't make out anything. Eventually, my head felt weary, and I followed Max's idea and used my jacket as a pillow. What are you doing? He asked. I'm tired, I responded. Yes, Fall asleep. Hey, don't judge me. You sat down first. Max said. I didn't say anything. As if electrocuted. Every hair on my body stood up, and I became tense, my eyes staring widely into the abyss above me. What? I asked. I didn't say anything. Max answered. We both stood up, gripping our jackets and each other. Just rest, a voice said again. It was close, somewhere around us. It sounded human and comforting, but upon hearing it again, it was clear that it wasn't mine or Max's. We started turning in circles, on guard for anything to come out at us. Max whispered, I say we run as fast as we can. Got it. The voice appeared again. Don't run. Be with me. It sent a shudder down our spines. It was different this time. Before it was a male voice. Now it sounded like the soothing tone of a mother tucking you into bed at night. Go, Max shouted, and we booked it. Admittedly, given our circumstances, we could have known it was pointless, but our need to survive took over. We ran as fast as we could, as fast as our tired legs allowed us. Max's ankle wasn't helping. Then there it was, in the distance. We saw a light. There was hope, and that propelled us to pick up the pace just a little. Arm in arm, we made our way towards the bright spot in the distance. I could hear Max's moans get increasingly more severe. He wouldn't be able to take much more. Then the light moved, ever so slightly. I stopped us in our tracks. Shh, I said to Max. The light almost danced, left to right and up and down. We couldn't help but follow it. As it danced, it became bigger and brighter. Oh shit, Max whispered. We hunkered down, but we knew it was too late. It was moving towards us. Oh shit, oh fuck, oh my fucking god. Max was losing it. I slapped his shoulder. Get it together. With the light, a figure appeared in the darkness. It followed the light, almost floating towards us. We had to shield our eyes from the bobbing ball that illuminated us. We had been in the dark so long that it felt as if we were looking into the sun. The orb moved to be just above us, and the figure stopped about 2 or 3 meters from us. Its back still covered in darkness. It looked like a woman, pale yet beautiful and naked. Please stay, she said. I'll make you comfortable. Max shouted. Just let us leave. Please! The figure receded back into the darkness and reappeared behind us. Now a man, just as pale and handsome. Max gripped me harder. I asked, how many are you? The man responded, only one, but I can be many. It looked at me and tilted its head. Why did you come here? We just wanted to explore, I said. You did. Your friend did not. My heart froze over, but Max tapped my shoulder. I wouldn't just abandon my friend like that, he answered. The creature moved closer to Max. I don't want you. You are no good to me anymore. Something came from the darkness and snatched Max. Even with the light, I couldn't make it out. A black mass entangled Max's legs and lifted him up. I managed to hold on to him, and a tug of war began. All the while Max was screaming. It nearly got dragged with him, but after a while, he seemed to have been released and dropped back onto the floor. This time he hit his head and was knocked out cold. I checked on him, but apart from a pulse and shallow breathing, there was no response. Curious, the man said. The way you fight back. Maybe I misjudged you. It came closer again. I could hear a large mass dragging and a foul smell emanating from the man's direction. I had to cover my nose for a second. What do you want from me? I asked. Your darkness. It gives me pleasure. What darkness? Why were you drawn to this place? Why wasn't your friend? I just wanted to explore. Wanted to do something. Yes, but didn't this place strike you as unusual? I looked down. Yes, you embraced the darkness. Why? You seem to know why. There was a guttural sound, profoundly unsettling and unholy. It sounded like laughter. Once again, the figure vanished and appeared beside me. Now a young woman, closer to my age. You want to stay here, don't you? Let the darkness around you match the one inside your mind. My hands became fists. What are you talking about? Do you really care where you are? The end would be just the same and just as welcomed. Your parents would be devastated either way. I twitched slightly. Did it know what I was thinking? I don't want to fucking die. I resisted. But you don't care if you do. It responded, and it was right. My body went limp, and again there was that unnatural laughter. The girl took a deep breath and smiled. Ah yes, despair. Humans are full of it. Human? What are you? The figure smiled, and the orb lowered to be just above my head. My eyes widened. As I followed it, I could see a long, thin stretch of skin elongate towards the figure, which was now raised up in the air, and in front of me were eyes, large, black, and too many to count, paired with one enormous row of sharp teeth. That was about as much as I could and wanted to make out. It spoke again, its maw unmoving, and its voice a cacophony of seemingly thousands of different people speaking in unison. See me? I wanted to run, but I knew it was futile. Besides, Max was still lying by my feet. I wouldn't just leave him with this monster. I couldn't help but my body began to shake, and I was beginning to hyperventilate. Yes, the creature droned, all its eyes fixed on me. Kneeling down, I felt the darkness encroach on me. What could it do? Should I just submit? Maybe I could bargain to save Max, and at least do one good thing with my life. I thought about it. In the end, what would happen if I made it out of this? Nothing good. I would be back to my same old, miserable life, only now with the knowledge that creatures like this exist. What if this wasn't the only one? What if there were more? Why did I have to go inside? Why? 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 My mind was spiraling once again. I could feel the monster drawing closer, soaking in my misery. Why wouldn't it just take me? Why make me choose? Was it savoring me? I asked. Why not just get it over with? Simple. Your total submission is the ultimate meal, the only way to make you mine. What if I refuse? It laughed, and its whole mass was shaking. I am older than your human history could ever conceive. I will wait. Others will come, and one day you will find your way back to me. I'm not bound here. I live in your darkness. That's it? I couldn't believe it, trying to hide my fear in a simple response. That's it. You will remember me. He won't. You will come back to me. Of that, I have no doubt. My darkness will always be there to comfort you. I took another look at Max and remembered the way he initially asked me to come out. And now here he is, stuck with me in this abomination. Nevertheless, I couldn't help but smile. He really was there for me. I want to leave. You are just another thing in my life. Another thing I will get over, just like I always do. The creature drew back a little, but I could make out how its teeth were forming a smile. So be it, it said, and suddenly everything went dark. And just like that, there was light again. I was lying on the concrete floor in a room filled with a huge generator and other electrical boxes. Just ahead of me was light, not some false promise, but sunlight. It was the door I had broken down earlier, illuminating my face. In the end, unobscured by some kind of eldritch magic. It really had just been a small building to do with the power grid. Max was next to me, also waking up. What the fuck happened? How did we fall asleep, and why do we look like shit? He asked. I was almost relieved. I didn't want him to remember, but I also didn't have an adequate explanation. I simply helped him up. His ankle was still messed up, and we humped out back into the forest. It couldn't have been more than maybe a few hours, if even. The sun had barely moved. I helped him back to my house, where I called him an ambulance to look at his injury. The entire time he was asking questions. I had no answer. I simply said that he tripped on a loose wire, twisted his ankle, and took me with him. He didn't believe me, but he also didn't press further. I don't think he really ever trusted me after that. Again, I could live with that. I had other concerns, and I was happy that he wouldn't have to live with what I had dragged him into. While I would like to say it ended there, It wasn't quite so. What we went through and what I had made Max endure, the memory of it or not, stayed with me, sending daggers through my heart. Then there was the unavoidable reality of what that monster had said to me. I tried to forget and move on. I even went back to Canada, trying to pick up my life. But I began having nightmares, constantly avoiding dark spaces and sleeping with all my lights on. I recently even started going to therapy. It was less to get better, but almost more as a declaration of a fight. That thing would not see me again. I had to get better. Well, I still don't have a job, which is partly why I'm writing this here. Seeing what others have witnessed here made me think it was as good a place as any to tell my story. Therapy helped a little, but my life is still not what I wanted it to be. But I'm trying to stay positive, yet I am afraid. What if I'm just lying to myself? Every time I feel my inner void getting the best of me, I try to think back. I think back to my family accepting me as I am, and how my friend decided to follow me into a hellhole just because he didn't want to leave me alone. Recently, I decided to take a walk through the local park. During the day, of course. Passing by the bathrooms, my eyes drifted, and instead of the halogen lamps, I saw only darkness. I've convinced myself that it was stress, some kind of PTSD, but I can't be sure. I put my head down and kept walking. So here's a bit of advice. Be happy. Trust me. I know it's hard, but there's always something. Find things to be happy about, because if you don't, something else might find you instead. Story 5. The lie is a cake. Day 1. A news report breaks in, redacted New York, about a man waking up the previous morning and attempting to turn on his TV to watch the latest episode of his favorite show, only for his remote to crumble in his hand. Confused as to what was going on, the man would attempt to manually turn on his TV, only to accidentally pull a chunk of it off. It was at this moment that the man would discover that his TV had been replaced with a hyper-realistic cake. The man would question his wife about where the TV went, and why there was a hyper-realistic cake in its place. However, his wife was just as confused as he was about the entire situation at hand. The man would attempt to report this to his local authorities, claiming his TV had been stolen and replaced with a hyper-realistic cake, only to be laughed off as a prankster due to his ridiculous claim. Angry at this, he would take his story to the local news station, hoping for justice to be served to whoever stole his TV. Once again, his claims were laughed off and published as a mere joke. The man would claim that there would be more cases of people's items being replaced with hyper-realistic cakes going forward, and that they would all regret ignoring his case. Day 29. Police reports coming from all over redacted New York would reveal the man's words to be correct. Starting after a young woman would attempt to open her purse, only for the zip to completely come off upon being pulled and quickly break apart, taking some of the modeling chocolate with it. Soon people would begin reporting all over the area that their items had been completely replaced with cake. Phones, laptops, bags, earrings, necklaces, rings and even stacks of cash were discovered to have been replaced with hyper-realistic cakes. Local authorities, having now clearly learned that this was no prank, are looking into the cases to try and track down these valuable items. However, one thing these cases all have in common, aside from the cakes being delicious, is the complete lack of evidence pointing to any suspects. No DNA evidence, no signs of forced entry, and no people in the area at the time. Nobody is even sure when these items were replaced with cakes. They all say they could have sworn they were real a second ago, only to suddenly be cake, almost as if there was no thief and they had just suddenly turned into cake. Authorities are still on the hunt for a possible suspect in this case, even though the wider New York authorities laugh at them for humoring these absurd claims. Day 47. The situation has escalated much further than anyone could have possibly anticipated. Now the reports of items being replaced with hyper-realistic cake have rapidly expanded to the rest of New York. Hundreds of people are reporting that their valuable items are being discovered to be hyper-realistic cakes. A man would take his phone out of his pocket to check if he'd received any important emails, only for his phone to crumble into pieces of cake in his hand. A woman would attempt to cash in a check of $100,000 to a bank, only for the modeling chocolate on the check to smash into several pieces when placed down on the counter. A couple would attempt to hurry their kids into the car, worrying they may be late for school, only for the car to fall apart right in front of them. As the door is pulled off and falls to the ground, people are getting scared. They're worrying that at any moment, any of their prized possessions could end up being a hyper-realistic cake. Nobody is sure what is real and what is cake anymore, so they've taken to trying to cut anything they own, hoping to weed out the cake from the non-cake. Many have ended up accidentally destroying many of the things they own in the process of doing this. But those who still have their stuff have taken to putting stickers on them to ensure they know they're real. That was until an edible sticker was found to be on the back of a hyper-realistic cake, emulating a mobile phone. Now, people's only option is to place all their valued possessions into safes, covered in locks with an 87 number code that not even they know. The governor of New York has commented on the situation, claiming that he's doing all he can to try and solve the hyper-realistic cake mystery. But he can only do so much to calm the fear and paranoia that has overcome New York. Day 93. The situation has dramatically escalated even further somehow, as the hyper-realistic cake plague has now begun heavily affecting the nearby states of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and even some parts of Canada. Reports are coming in from all over the USA and even some of Mexico and South America of people's items suddenly being replaced with ominous, albeit tasty, hyper-realistic cakes. The president is doing nothing to quell the fear of US citizens, claiming the whole situation is ridiculous and that everyone is a fool for buying into it. People are starting to riot in the streets, believing the president is not doing enough to try and prevent the appearance of hyper-realistic cakes. Many other countries are beginning to consider closing off all travel to the USA out of fear, and some like Germany even going through with it. The safes people were using to hold their valuable items are no longer safe. Many have been discovered to have been replaced with hyper-realistic cakes, leading to even greater fear and paranoia among citizens. And the worst thing of all, the police officer who was in charge of the case in redacted New York was discovered by his wife the previous night to have been replaced with an identical hyper-realistic cake. There is no evidence of where he may have gone, and there is no evidence pointing to who might have taken him. He has seemingly disappeared without a trace. Day 149, as fear was reaching its limits, a spark of hope managed to emerge. Tension has been rising as countries all over the world have been receiving reports of people disappearing and being replaced with hyper-realistic cakes, even including those that shut off travel to the USA. The president has continued to display pure apathy to the situation, claiming the whole thing to be a farce, until he discovered one morning his wife had been turned into a hyper-realistic cake. Outraged at this, he demanded the perpetrator be immediately found and caught. He banned the selling of any ingredients that could be used to make a hyper-realistic cake, including flour, sugar, eggs, butter, baking powder, chocolate, honey, macaroni and cheese. He does not know how to make a cake and decided it was better safe than sorry. But even then, hyper-realistic cakes continued to appear. Now even houses and everything in them were getting replaced with giant, hyper-realistic cakes, twice the size of an average human being. The president was getting desperate now and was willing to do anything to catch the man responsible for this. So he had cameras set up on every street in every city in every state across the entire USA, and he had every cop working 24/7 on the site of each camera, making sure nothing was replaced with a hyper-realistic cake. And if they were to see hyper-realistic cake-related activities, they were to press a button, sounding the alarm. Yesterday, after weeks and weeks of nothing, an extremely tired officer managed to catch a woman attempting to replace a baby with a hyper-realistic cake. The woman, upon being caught, would quickly admit she was behind the hyper-realistic cake shenanigans. She was immediately brought to Washington, D.C., where the president would proceed to scream and cry at, her for hours before demanding she be placed in a holding cell so she could be questioned the following day. This was quickly announced by White House officials, and the world began celebrating, praising the president as a hero who was able to end the hyper-realistic cake plague. The joyful people of the world are currently awaiting a word from the US president on who this mysterious woman is, what her motives are, and where she's keeping all these missing people. Day 180. To the horror of everyone around the globe, the following morning, all hope was lost and all dreams were dashed. The woman taken captive last night was found to have been replaced with a hyper-realistic cake. Just as everyone was, the president demanded a search for any evidence indicating how she could have escaped. But they were unable to find anything. Even the cameras meant to keep track of the woman had mysteriously failed to capture anything the previous night. This was the breaking point for the president, and as a result of this, he'd soon become wrapped up in an extremely insane conspiracy. He'd soon begin to believe the cake was a being that was more powerful than any of them, and that it needed to be eradicated at all costs. The presidents would proceed to declare martial law and cut off all transport to other countries. People, seeing exactly what was going to happen, attempted to escape the country by piloting the planes and boats themselves, only to discover the planes and boats were all hyper-realistic cakes that were unable to fly and would easily sink in water. The president would also declare that all cake is to be thoroughly burned, and anyone believed to be a cake is to be executed on sight, preferably by being cut with a blade. The president would have all Secret Service agents executed, claiming that they were conspiring with the cake and aided the woman in escaping custody. But even if this wasn't enough for the president, soon he'd begin believing that other countries were made of cake too, and declared that any countries believed to be cake countries would be bombed off the map. Starting with Mexico, he sent wave after wave of bombs to the country until he was sure anyone inside was dead. He'd soon turn his attention to Germany, believing that it was also a cake country due to them previously closing off transportation from the USA there. Soon, Germany was no more, and the president would celebrate that he had destroyed another cake country. It seemed like to the president that every country except the USA was a cake country, and no amount of bombing he did would change that. Everyone knew the sheer amount of bombs he was using was going to destroy the planet, but he didn't care. But just as quickly as this began, it ended. Yesterday, a large angry mob stormed the White House. The president would attempt to bomb the mob, only to discover the bomb launch pad had been replaced with cake. The mob quickly overpowered anyone left supporting the president with sheer numbers, and they swiftly beat the president to death in a manner too disturbing to even attempt to describe. Blood was everywhere, but they didn't care anymore. The dictator was dead. Day 294. Shortly after the president's death, the USA descended into chaos. People were still being replaced with cake, and nobody had any way to contact people outside the USA, as every single phone was seemingly now a hyper-realistic cake. Many don't even believe there's anyone left out there, and that they were all killed by the president. People quickly began to believe the president was right, and that all the other countries were now just cake. But they took it one step further. They now began to ponder if the entire globe itself was just one giant cake. People began getting so scared of others being cake that they would attempt to cut anyone they meet just to see if they were cake. There is no food left now besides hyper-realistic cakes, and many are so scared of them that they refuse to even go near them, let alone attempt to eat them. Many are dying from starvation, and those willing to eat the cakes are usually branded as cake people and killed on sight. There's still no sign of the people who went missing and were replaced with hyper-realistic cakes. Many believe they just vanished from reality itself, or that they were taken by the cake. Some people have begun to worship the cake as a god and make sacrifices to it, believing it'll bring their loved ones back. Reality is crumbling. Society has fallen apart, and it won't be long until humanity is gone. Day 334. Not even a year following the first ever incident. The last human being on Earth has died today, alone, cold and afraid. There is nothing left. No trees, no grass, no water, no animals, no humans. Nothing. The only thing that remains now is the hyper-realistic cakes. And that is the story of how I destroyed humanity with fucking cakes. I guess in the end you could say it was real. Story 6. My cat always leaves me the best gifts. On the morning of Mother's Day this year, I received exactly one gift, a dead rat, deposited at my doorstep by my cat, James. James is black and white, slick and elegant, his fur like a tuxedo. If a cat was cast to replace Daniel Craig in the next Bond film, James would be perfect. In fact, the resemblance is how he got his name in the first place. "Thank you, James," I said, bending to stroke his fur as we both examined the little rotting carcass on the welcome mat. He looked up at me hopefully, as if expecting me to take a nibble of his offering. "I'll get to that later," I promised. The rest of the family had forgotten the holiday. Not that I blamed them. My husband Saito was busy at work, pulling 70-hour shifts as he prepared a series of PowerPoints to explain his company's corporate structure to a potential buyer. In the meantime, the twins June and Lily were busy with spring soccer and last-minute prep for their upcoming AP tests. I spent some time idly making myself coffee while the family slept. Then, around 9, and they all flew past in flurry, the twins off to a soccer game and Saito headed to the office. It wasn't until they'd all left that a lump began to form in my throat, and I headed to the backyard to have a little cry. I felt silly. It was a made-up holiday. After all, not like Christmas or a birthday, though Saito forgot my birthday too this year. For a few minutes, I sat on one of the patio chairs, sniffling pathetically, hoping no one returned early to see me like this. I was about to go back in when I saw James. He was over in the corner of the yard, lying in the shade. Right away, I could tell something was off about him. James always slept curled in a ball, his chin resting on his rear haunch. Today, he was stretched out, bent awkwardly. Even stranger, he seemed to shimmer in the few spots where the dappled sunlight caught his fur. Slowly, I walked over, clicking my tongue in the way he liked. When he didn't move, I softly called his name. Finally, I reached out to touch him, only to find his fur wet. Drawing my hand back, I found it red and bloody in the sunlight, which is when I started screaming. I called Saito a few minutes later. "I need you to come home," I said. "James is dead." "Your friend James? From college?" "Our cat." I realized I was screaming into the phone. "Our only cat." I could practically hear him roll his eyes on the far end of the line. "It's not a good day for this," he said. "I can come back a bit early, take care of the body. Just leave it alone for now." I spent many hours alone that day, sitting in the backyard. In time, flies found James and began to lick at him with their little straw mouths, dipping their horrible little hands in his blood and rubbing them together. It was no use shooing them away. I was sunburned raw by the time Saito came home. He looked at me, incredulous. "What happened to you?" "I was standing vigil," I explained. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose. "Where's the cat?" he asked, and I gestured to the backyard. Every inch of my skin throbbed from the sunburn, but it felt right, like my inside and outside pain matched in some harmonious way. Saito grabbed a wastebasket and started walking toward the backyard. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Taking care of James," he said, trying to use a gentle tone, as if explaining to a child that it was time for bed. "You'll bury him," I said, "at the foot of the maple, 3 feet deep at least." He shook his head. "That's not even legal. Hon. Besides, I was working all day. I'm exhausted." 3 feet deep, I said, and then I went into the garage to find his shovel. The one I located was unused, though we must have bought it years ago. I brought it in and handed it to Saito. He took it without a word and went outside. An hour later, he came in dirty and sweaty. He headed to the shower. I walked to the maple to find the earth there freshly disturbed from digging. Then I found one of James's favorite toys, a fuzzy bird that had once had a bell inside, and affixed it to a stick, which I placed at the head of the grave. At dinner, the twins showed up still in their soccer uniforms. They'd spent the day at the park with friends after the game. "Happy Mother's Day," said June, somewhat sheepishly. She handed me an envelope with a gift card to Jazzy Juice inside. "Thanks," I said. "What's Jazzy Juice?" "It's a smoothie thing," explained Lily. "It's $20. "Thank you," I said again, staring at the card. Maybe I was making a face. "If you don't want it, I can take it back," said June. "My friends and I go there all the time." "No," I said. "I love it. I'm sure I'll love it." "Great," she said, looking disappointed. The next morning I went out into the backyard and screamed. James's grave had been dug up. It was nothing but an empty hole surrounded by a pile of dirt. The stick and the toy were missing too. It didn't seem that deep. By the time Saito ran out to see what was wrong, I was in tears. 3 feet deep," I shouted. I said 3 feet deep. "The soil gets really rocky when you go down that far," he said. I figured it didn't matter. "It mattered," I screamed. I decided to take some me time that afternoon, so I headed to Jazzy Juice. I tried to figure out the menu while I was in line, but I got overwhelmed by all the options. Finally, when I got to the front of the line, I asked if I could just get a basic orange juice. "It would be more like an orange smoothie," said the girl behind the counter, a thin redhead in her 20s, covered in tattoos. "Oh, that's no good," I said. "I don't really like pulp." "No pulp, please." "That's not really what we do here," she said. "Maybe it's a good day to try something new. The berry blitz is super popular." "I want my orange juice," I said. I was probably a little rude, but I was at my limit. "I've got a gift card," I added, "for $20. "Fine," she said. And then, I swear, under her breath she added, "Boomer bitch." "Excuse me?" She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she turned and started throwing frozen oranges into a blender. "I'm 44, I shouted over the noise as she started the blender. "I'm a millennial, maybe Gen X." Finally, she handed me my drink. It was so pulpy it clogged the straw. She shot me a shit-eating smile. "Have a nice day." I chucked my drink in the garbage on my way out the door. That night, I found myself crying as I tried to make dinner. I could see the little hole that had once contained James's body through the kitchen window, and I couldn't help glancing at it as I tried to peel zucchini. It struck me that James had been the only one in the world who loved me at all. Even worse, it seemed unlikely that no one would ever love me again. I was aging, chubby, and boring. The world didn't want me anymore. Without realizing it, I made a deep cut on my thumb and started bleeding everywhere. For a minute, I just watched the blood ooze out of me, all over the vegetables. That night, I heard a thump. I tried to shake Saito awake, but he was dead asleep. Finally, I got up and walked downstairs. There was another thump now, louder, then a series of 3 more thuds right by the front door. Slowly, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and then walked through the darkness. As I did, I heard a familiar sound that seemed impossible. It was James's distinctive meow, the little cry he'd deliver at the door when he wanted my attention. And yet it was somehow different now, a lower, deeper mewing. "Hello?" I asked as I walked to the door, but there was no sound now. I heard footsteps outside. Not a cat's, but something bigger, maybe human. Finally, I reached the door and slowly turned the knob. I opened it just a crack, peeking through to see if anyone was outside. At first, I saw no one, just the empty street in the moonlight. A few night-blooming flowers had opened their petals, but otherwise the neighborhood looked dull and lifeless. Then I looked down and had to stifle a scream. There, On my doorstep lay a body, its chest still fluttering with life, but mostly torn to shreds. Great. Bloody gashes had left the green apron in tatters. The skin's intricate tattoos sundered to islands of nonsense. The girl's red hair was now redder. Though her skull was crushed, her pretty face nearly ripped off the bone. I knew immediately it was the girl from the juice shop. My body tensed as I watched her chest cease its fluttering, and the flow of blood slowed to a trickle. Soon, she was still as the rest of the street. Then, suddenly, my heart was pounding again, as I realized I was not alone in the darkness. Something dark and massive was moving past the nearby bushes, watching me examine its kill. Though it moved somewhat like a cat, the thing was far bigger, larger than any tiger I'd ever seen at the zoo. As it grew closer, I saw that it was standing on its hind legs, walking toward me, not quite like a person, but like an animal trying to mimic one. I could barely breathe now. It was growing closer. Though it moved slowly, I could sense that it could cover the 10 feet between us in a moment, far faster than I could slam the door. "Please," I said. "Don't." As the creature walked into a slant of moonlight, I realized that it was dressed in a tuxedo, or were those just the colors of its fur? "My queen, I would never," the creature purred, in a low voice. "I live only to serve you." I looked down at the dead girl by my feet. I would have to call the police. I knew I would have to scream for Saito to come and help. There would be so much to explain, but I wasn't afraid now. That moment had passed. I was here with a friend. "James?" I asked, and he nodded ever so slightly. "You can't do this," I said. "I didn't want this." "But she was so cruel to you," said James. "She called you a very nasty name. I was hiding a few blocks away, but I heard everything. My ears are very sensitive." "But you can't just kill people," I said, trying to stuff my growing panic into my stomach. It's not right." "Of course I can," said James. "In fact, I must. It's my nature." "Never again," I whispered. James cocked his head, looking me in the eyes. What was he looking for? "I could stop if you order it," he said, "though that would be unfortunate. You know I love to honor you with gifts. I always have, but go ahead. Make the command and I will disappear, never to leave you another present again." I looked down at the dead girl, all torn to shreds. There was a certain beauty in it, like a stained glass window, sublime in its brokenness. "Just say the word," James said again. But I didn't. "Thank you," I finally said, bending to look closer at the dead girl, "for the gift." "It was but a trifle, my queen," said the thing. "Until next time." And then, bowing slightly, he backed away and bounded into the darkness. Story 7. Wonderful things. I always loved nightmares. Quite strange, I suppose. There was just something about the experience, about feeling a feeling that is hard to find in everyday life. Then you'd wake up and feel a wash of relief and calm once you knew it wasn't real, that it was all in your head, that life was good, and there weren't any real horrors to be afraid of. Not horror like we dream of, at any rate. Horror films had always been the same for me. Good ones were, at least. They'd invite you in and give you a wonderful gift. They'd let you feel terror and dread and fear. Always you could step away once it was over. You could wake up from the nightmare and feel the relief at the end. It always struck me as strange that the more skilled an author or director, the more negative emotion you felt, whereas with almost any other media relationship there was inverted. This is why it was so upsetting to me that I stopped being afraid. I think it was a result of familiarity, rather than any particular braveness on my part. One can only watch someone be torn apart so many times before the reality of cameras and performance and film sets became apparent. One can only watch darkness resolve itself into so many nightmare forms before the next one becomes just another one, no longer a new terror, just the same old fear, wearing a new face. Games, movies, books, they all lost their edge to me. I looked into it some, and I wasn't alone, though that wasn't much solace to me. Many fans of the macabre genres mentioned becoming numb to the scares, inoculated to the invasion of the mind that horror relies on. I didn't want to lose it, though. I often wished I could see anew the things that once made my hair stand on end and left me breathing hard or waking in a sweat-soaked bed. I was thinking on this same line one night after I had just finished another horror. I had been hoping against hope that it might illuminate for me some new darkness. It failed. Maybe I failed. To me, it was the same old fare. The tension builds and the music fades and the pretty little thing rounds a tiny little corner. And nothing, always nothing, because it's behind her. It's always behind her. But luckily she jets off quick and just in time too. So very tiring to watch. I finished the film close to midnight, dissatisfied. I turned off the TV and dropped the remote on the table with a clang. It was cold outside of the blanket that I had entombed myself in on the couch, and the goosebumps on my arms from the chill were the only ones I had felt that night. I crossed the room, opened the door and stared out into a dark hallway. They always scared me as a kid. Well, not the hallways themselves, but the long, dark length of them in the night. A space to transition that was absent of exits for their duration, and unless the light was on, their far ends always managed to be occluded from the light. Just enough gloom to let the imagination roam. That night I cast my mind back to when I was a child. I stepped from the living room and stopped. The hallway was before me, and on my right was a small alcove that only held a coat rack, some shoes and the front door. Tonight, dim as the house was, it was just a dark corner. As a child, there could have been anything lurking in that darkness. Did the coat rack shift? As a child, I would have been certain of it. Now, not so much. The feeling still lingered there, under the surface, under the layers and layers of conscious thought that had been built from years of adult life, telling me that nothing lurked in the dark. I might have felt my heart rate pick up just slightly, nothing to be frightened of, but there was that unmistakable feeling of not wanting to turn my head and look. There was nothing there. I knew that, but looking just felt unpleasant, so I walked on into the dark of the hall. As a child, it would have been now that the fear truly set in. Walking away from whatever hidden terror lurked in the nighttime hours of my home. Was it following, padding or slithering or crawling or stalking down the hall behind me? Could I cross the space, more vast to my young legs than it is now, before whatever it was could get me? I would have run to my room, thrown on the light and dove for the bed. Safety that we all know intrinsically. In the bed you're safe, and if the monsters should come and press you further, then the ironclad protection of diving under the covers was only inches away. The child's panic room. Not a terror in this world can get you under the covers. Now there's just the lingering memory of that fear. Still there was the unpleasantness of not wanting to turn and face whatever I knew wasn't there in the dark. Mere moments later I was in my room, lights off, feeling no fear, and crawling into a bed that no longer served as a bastion of safety. Now it was a portal to commuting and co-workers and workplace drudgery. That night I dreamt. I thought I was in my room. But then I wasn't. But really I was. You know how dreams go. I heard whispering all around me, and the sense that the room was filled to bursting with things that I couldn't see was overpowering. From the darkness, a shape caught my notice. Tall, nearly the height of my wardrobe, which was nearly the height of my room. Lanky and narrow. Then there was light, flashing in through my shuttered window in narrow bars from traffic outside. The thin shafts lanced through my room, landing on white skin, ashen and cracking like parchment, like a painting that had seen years of neglect. The figure turned, and before I could glimpse its face, the light faded. The traffic had moved on. The shape turned further in the darkness, and a tiny prick of light glinted at me from its eye. "I have something wonderful to show you." The voice grated at me. I woke with a start. I had the sense that much, much more had transpired while I was in the dream, but that was all that I could recall. I couldn't stop playing it over in my mind. It had spoken with such glee, barely contained excitement. Like a dog too small and excitable to contain its urges, but too well trained to move from where it was commanded. Shaking and quivering and just a word away from being let free. A knock sounded at my door shortly after. "You know it's 9. said my housemate James.
Fucker,
I cursed and launched out of bed. I was supposed to be at work at 8. I showered and dressed in a flurry, got to work, endured the jibes but didn't really pay them much mind. I was too distracted by the voice playing over and over in my head. It stayed with me for hours that day. I tried to tell my friends about how cool it had been, but they never really got it. They weren't really into horror, didn't really like it. You weren't supposed to like it. I'd never get that. Still, it was the first time I'd been properly afraid in, geez, how long had it been? Years? I spent a long time wondering if thinking about that long-lost feeling of fear had been what caused such a vivid dream. For weeks after that night, I thought about the darkness in the house. I courted the idea of things lurking all around me, watching from every unobserved corner of the house. There must be many of these old fears, I thought. Things that get neutered with our modern life. Light everywhere, food readily available, police to call on should someone wish you harm. But they must still linger in us. None were so easy to find as the lurker in the dark. I spent some time trying to see the world through a new lens. Each night when I would go to bed, there were sounds from the tree outside my room. Bats had come to live in it months ago, and they would squeak and squeal and make all sorts of noise. But with the right framing, they became shrieks of pain. Something was tearing them apart, attacking them in the night. They would scamper away and be hunted again and again each night. The calls went from a friendly reminder of my nocturnal friends to the pained pleas of a creature in agony. Of course I knew they weren't. Rational thought would constantly prevail. Yet, now and again, a shriek would sound out in the dead of night, just as I was slipping into the stupor of sleep, and a spike of fear would shoot through me. It became like a game. What things had horror in them? Could I pull the nightmares out and into the waking world? Commuting became an exploration of the gore that a car crash might wreak. Limbs torn free from conscious owners by savage shards of steel and glass, or ground away by asphalt. Conversations with friends became investigations into the mind of a serial killer that wanted dearly to keep their secret hidden. How could I know? You hear it time and again. The news reporter turns and stuffs a microphone into the red face of a wide-eyed friend or relative. Always the same. I had no idea. This, or he seemed so normal. That. Well, I'm no better. How could I tell? My friend that just cracked a great joke and smiled at me with love in his eyes could have just come from gleefully snapping the fingers of his latest captive in the pits he left them in. And all the while I would walk through a dark house and feel that sense of dread that loomed unseen in every black corner. It should have been obvious to me, I suppose, because it is. The places I was finding the fear, what I was uncovering, they were all within me. Maybe I had lost touch with horror from films or in games, but the things that lurked under the surface, away from sensible thought, they weren't things that were shown to me by a director or an author. They were all things that were a part of me, a part of all humans. They were the neurosis embedded in all of us from thousands of years of trauma. There was a horror in me that could never be taken away. I couldn't believe what a wonderful gift that realization was. Maybe it wasn't as easy to find, and maybe it wasn't as shocking as a jump scare or as ominous as well-executed prose, but it was always there, lingering just a few inches down in the grey matter. I dreamt again that night, the night I had the realization. I was in my room again. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but it probably should have seemed strange to me. How often does a dream happen somewhere familiar? No often for me. I was all too often in the land of a video game, or in the wilderness, or a busy city, or a place that was familiar only from distant memory. But this night was my room again. Outside were the calls of small animals being torn apart. Without looking, I knew my friends were out there. Flashes appeared in my mind's eye. Warm smiles ran red, and gore dripped from laughing faces. In my room, the tall figure shook and trembled. I don't recall when it was that I became aware that it was in the room with me, but in the room it was. No light graced the shadows this time. When it turned to look at me, the prick of light that shone from its eye glowed a deep red. Brighter this time, more intense, and a fainter dim light shone from the cracks in its skin. Jagged lines crazed across its face. It smiled at me, and a mouth with too many teeth split its face. Its skin again cracked like plaster at the corners of its grin. I want to show you something wonderful." I didn't wake. I didn't know I was asleep. I just remember pulling away, only there was nowhere to pull away to. I was in my bed. Behind me, only a bedhead and solid wall. But that didn't stop me trying back away, right through both. The dark mass of its form didn't draw any closer, but its face did. Every moment it drew a little closer. It seemed to grow more and more excited, and the grin grew wider and wider. Its pale skin cracked and peeled, and more of the red glow shone through from somewhere else. I tried to speak, but found my jaw heavy, locked up. Panic set in shortly after, as I realized that I couldn't move at all. Not just my jaw, but all of me. I strained against the sensation and managed, after what could have been years for all I knew, to slowly pull the covers up and over my head. I woke shortly after, and as with the last time, I couldn't recall much of what had happened. What I have recounted for you here feels to me as if it was only a fraction of what actually happened, but if it is, or not, I can't say. Finding all these new sources of fear had been an amazing discovery for me, but I was struggling to find an off switch. In the weeks following that latest dream, I had a date with a lady I had met online. It was something I was thrilled about, owing mostly to having been chronically single for near on half a decade. Each time I let my mind wander, I would find it poking about in the darker reaches of my imagination. If she asks me to come back to her place, what should I keep an eye out for? Just in case? How do I tell if she's a nut job? Do I plan a way out, or do I just refuse to go back to begin with? I would catch myself doing it and patiently remind myself how silly all of it was. Without fail, though, my mind would once again venture back to the darker lands that lingered on the edges of rational thought. When I met her, she seemed lovely. They probably all do, before. I cracked a joke, and the smile disappeared from her features a fraction before her laughter faded. Was it a fake smile? Fake laughter? Perhaps both. Sure, it was insane to think that a smile's fading was enough to confirm malicious intent. I knew that. But they always say trust your instincts, right? Towards the end of the date, she had begun to give me strange looks. I think she knew I had worked out that she wasn't just out with me to have a coffee and a nice time. It was only later that evening, when I was alone at home, that I realized how insane I was being. But then again, even that thought was one I didn't hold with much confidence. How did I know she wasn't there to hurt me? I paced around the house trying to understand why I was so fixated on the idea. All through the house, shadows paraded around behind my back. I didn't look. I knew that if I looked, I wouldn't see anything. So why look? My skin prickled, and I eventually ended up in an armchair in the corner of the living room. It just felt more secure to have my back to the walls. That night I just sat and thought. For hours. I knew full well that all of these mental musings were just that, but it didn't seem to matter. Yes, they were just in my head, but I had already come to the understanding that horror lived inside of my mind. You watch a film and the horror screws its way into your mind long before the jump comes, because it isn't the film that contains the horror. It's in all of us. In me. Stuck in me. The film just formats it, gives it ladder to climb up out of the pit it lives in. You are asked if you remember the shadows stirring in the woods at night, and you do. Locked away. Yes. But you know that fear. You know all of the fears that they show you. If you didn't, you couldn't be afraid of it. You would just be confused. So who cares that the thoughts were all just in my head? That's where they always were. The problem wasn't that I was imagining horrors, it was that I couldn't stop imagining them. After my date, I tried to talk to my friends, but the thoughts kept bubbling up. They looked so human. I knew they were. They were. Obviously they were. It didn't seem to matter. One of them picked up a steak knife to cut his food, and I couldn't stay. I didn't know that he wasn't a fucking killer, or simply just insane. What if today was the day that he finally snapped? What if he had been fighting off delusions for years? Today could be the day. That knife could be the knife. I never knew he wasn't insane. No one knows these things. I could rationalize it all I wanted, but when I took inventory of what I actually knew, him being a safe person to be around just wasn't in there. We all just tell ourselves that our friends are sound, and sometimes we're wrong. It wasn't delusion that told me he could be a twisted monster. That was possible. I ran it through my mind over and over, and each time, like a calculator solving the same basic equation, It came back the same. I truly couldn't be certain he didn't mean me any harm. I ran to my car and sat in the driver's seat, trying to turn the key but couldn't bring myself to drive. I walked home. Every light at home was switched on as soon as I arrived. The light helped. I sat in the chair, shaking, and drank in the light. I had taken to sleeping in the chair. I didn't want to face the hallway. Did I leave the door open? I knew I didn't. I was terrified of the darkness in the hall. Of course I closed the door. This wasn't making any sense to me. I knew somewhere, rattling about in my head, that this was all my own creation. There wasn't anything that posed any real threat to me, but a real threat had lost meaning for me, and as soon as the idea formed, it slipped away. Even to me was starting to give me pause. I was someone that found fear in every moment. I was someone that couldn't trust his friends to keep him safe. I couldn't trust the shadows in my home to stay put. Who I was someone for whom real danger emerged from nothing. That wasn't who I had been. Was I a different person now? I kept telling myself, just stop thinking about it. It makes me laugh now. Just don't think about it. You might forget about a joke or misplace your keys. But every moment I lived was becoming an exploration of horror. The very experience of existence was my cure to imagine what terror might be contained within it. How did one stop thinking about the thing that they were constantly being reminded of? That night I fell asleep in the chair, but my dream found me once again in my bedroom, curled into a tight ball. Screams blared into my ears and faces danced at my window. I took handfuls of the covers in bunched fists and pulled them tightly over my head. I could feel him in the corner. The room shook from his trembling. I wouldn't look. The corpses of small animals battered my window like rain. Knocks came at the door. Friends, just here to check up on me, make sure I was okay. The tremors from the corner were joined by a sound like frenzied breathing. The sound grew closer, crossing my bedroom slowly until it was just above me. I scrunched my eyes closed and refused to move. The shaking never grew any closer, but the sound of breathing shifted to the foot of my bed, then became slightly muffled. I felt veins in my neck swell with my quickening pulse. My knuckles ached, and I pulled my legs up tighter beneath me. The covers lifted slightly around me, and the sound of frantic, excited, joyous breathing became loud in my ears before stopping abruptly. I knew it was there, under the covers with me. The silence hurt and my skin crawled. I wasn't going to look. Whatever wonder it wanted to show me, I wasn't going to see. I had seen quite enough. I could feel breath on my face. The shaking lingered, as did the silence. I felt as though I could vaguely see red through my closed eyelids. "I'm not looking," I cried. "Don't want to see what you want to show me." I could hear the sound of plaster cracking as it opened its mouth, and the red light grew behind my closed eyes. "Oh, there is no need now. Sweet thing, you have seen all I had to show you. The wonder lives in you now. You found it all on your own." I woke up, still curled into a ball and with fists aching. The covers were soaked through with sweat and I could feel my clothes sticking to me. That same old feeling of relief was thankfully there for me, and I let out a shaky breath. As I opened my eyes, the face stared back at me from beneath the covers. The eyes burned my skin with blinding red light, shining from another place. The face poured flakes of ashen, plaster skin all around as its mouth snapped open. When I did truly wake, I was exhausted. The feel of missing a lot of what had happened was still there. It started to worry me much more then than it had before. If I don't recall what is happening in my dreams, how often is my unconscious mind being tormented without my knowing? How much of my unawake life was devoted to being violated by that thing? And more disturbingly, had this always been true? How many hours had I spent in terror, only to have the waking world wash them away? What could that have done to my mind? It said that I had learned what it wanted to show me all on my own. Was that real? What was in my mind and what was real had left me as a points of distinction. There wasn't anything that was real that wasn't also a figment of my mind. If this thing lived only in me, then that just meant it was real only for me, but not that it wasn't any less real. That was all some time ago. I don't quite know who I am anymore. I know that part of me is this thing. Part of me is the mangled bodies of a car crash, the twisted forms of disease and sickness, and the malformed offspring of damaged genes. Part of me is the grin of the killer, as he follows you home and turns an unlocked door handle. Part of me lives in that dark corner of your room, and part of me lurks behind you, while you traverse the places where you think you're safe but just aren't quite sure. Part of me is the man that I always was. Part of me, though, is the being that isn't quite bothered so much that you too have seen the wonderful things that come from looking too deeply for what you know is there. Part of me wishes you would take care with what you seek to find, and part of me knows that it's far too late for all of that. I wonder sometimes if I was always all of these things, or if they only come from looking too deeply. Now I suppose you can help me find out. Story 8. My name is Allison, and I'm a snuff film star. No, I don't have the source for the movies, and before you ask, it's not mainstream porn you can find by just Googling my name. They're videos of me being murdered. Where would you even find those types of videos? The dark web, maybe? I don't know. I don't like watching myself being murdered. What I can tell you is, I've starred in over 50 movies, and according to the guy who distributes them, I'm the most watched and most sought-after snuff star in history, if that's even a thing. You're probably wondering how one would even get into that business. Well, the short answer is by accident. You don't wake up one day and decide you want to be murdered. In my case, I answered an ad looking for an amateur porn actress. I was just starting out in the business, and the pay seemed reasonable. When I arrived at the location, which was a house in an upmarket location, it didn't raise any red flags. It all seemed legit until I asked to be paid up front. And the response was, "Let's see how you die first." Before I knew it, I was being held down and the cameras began rolling. All I can say is dying is like going to sleep during surgery. It's painful at the start and scary. But when your heart starts slowing down, you get a rush of euphoria and everything goes silent before the lights go out. I couldn't tell if there was an afterlife. I don't stay dead long enough to find out. It's like going to sleep without dreaming. There's a nanosecond of darkness before you wake up again. You would think that a guy whose business is death would be easily scared. But when I suddenly woke up as they were loading me into a shallow grave in the woods, he screamed like a little girl. It took some time to calm him down. You would swear it was him that was just brutally murdered with the way he reacted. But once the initial shock wore off, he looked me dead in the eye, no pun intended, and said, "I'm going to make you a fucking star." I can't go into details on how I get snuffed out, but I can say the money is great, more than I could ever make being in mainstream porn. The problem isn't the fact that my employer is a death dealer of women. Actually, no women have been murdered apart from me, of course, since I started. The problem is the reaction I'm starting to get the more my popularity grows. The surprising thing is, the people who notice me are the most ordinary people you could imagine, not monsters that hide away in the shadows fantasizing about murdering women. I mean school teachers, doctors, and even young teenagers. The biggest shock for me was when I was sitting in a cafe and I was approached by a young dad who had his 2 young daughters with him. He sat staring at me while his daughters sat eating chocolate muffins. I knew why he was looking at me, even if he didn't. As I was finishing up my latte, I looked up to see him standing next to me with a strange grin on his face. "Do I know you from somewhere?" he suddenly asked. I was in my comfort clothes, a baggy t-shirt with a pair of sweatpants, and the tattoo of a pentagram on my arm was on show. He began studying me to figure out how he knew me, and when I was just about to speak, he noticed the tattoo on my arm. It was like a light switched on in his brain, and he suddenly realized where he knew me from. His face turned deathly pale, and he began to stutter a bit before he hurried himself and his daughters out of the cafe. I was never really worried about being noticed before, because the men that watched me expected me to be dead. I also never gave a second thought to my tattoo being the thing that gave me away. I mean, how many girls out there have the same tattoo? When I got it done, I was told it was a popular choice. That all changed when I got a phone call from my mother. My poor mother had no clue about the type of business I was in. She always thought I was into some lifestyle stuff, like a trainer to the stars or something. I think the dream was better than the reality, and she always told her friends I was a successful businesswoman of some sort. Technically, she wasn't wrong. All that changed when she rang me in hysterics. She could barely contain herself over the phone. "You're alive. You're alive," is all she kept on repeating down the phone. After I calmed her down and reassured her I was very much alive, I waited until her breathing had slowed to a more relaxed state. Alison. For a moment I thought I was speaking to a ghost. My mother was always my biggest fan in life, and it broke my heart to hear her this upset. "The police were here. Men in suits. Detectives, I think. They told me you were dead. Oh, my sweet girl, they told me you were dead. They had found blood and something about a tape or the internet. The bastards gave me a heart attack. I knew you weren't dead." That night, I went to stay with my mother, just to reassure her that I was still physically present and to just hug her. Mainly to reassure myself that I was definitely still present in this world. Deep down, I knew what this was about. Of course, someone who wasn't a degenerate monster was going to watch my movies and try to put a name on the woman who should be somewhere in a shallow grave. But I always thought people would think the movies were just great fakes because you can only be the star of one snuff movie, not 50. A few weeks had passed, and apart from my mother losing a year or two of her life, things had settled down. I had decided to quit. It was never going to be a long-term thing, but if I was going to stop, my final movie was going to be my best. Go out with a bang, I always say. It was the day of the shoot, and on the way to the location, I couldn't escape the feeling I was being watched. I put it down to my nerves because I was going to die in the most brutal way possible. It was going to be so bad no one was ever going to think it was faked. And the fact it was going to be the last video of me made it sound all the more believable. I knew it was going to be painful, but the pain never lasted, and all I was thinking was, it's going to be a spectacular death, and it was. But as the euphoria swept over me and I began to slip into the darkness, I watched as men in SWAT gear burst into the room, followed by men in suits. As always, I came back to life with a big gasp of air, like a baby taking its first breath after being expelled from the womb. I was expecting to be in the room where I was murdered, but this time I found myself on a cold metal slab. As I looked around what looked like an operating room, I saw two men in suits. One was smiling, while the other appeared to hand over money from his wallet. "Hi, welcome back. I just bet my colleague $50 that you would come back from the dead," he said as he put the note into his top pocket. "I must say, I am a big fan of your movies. Damsel in the Dungeon is my personal favorite," said the smartly dressed man as he smiled down at me. This was the first time I had ever felt in danger. A sudden panic washed over me as I tried to get up off the table. The two men in suits smiled at each other before handing me a hospital gown. "Where am I?" I asked nervously. "You have nothing to worry about. It's not like we are going to kill you," said one of the men as they burst out laughing. The two men walked me to an interview room and sat me down at a table opposite them. "You still haven't told me who you are and my reasons for being here." The two men adjusted themselves into a more serious posture. "Sorry for the confusion. My name is Agent Harris and my colleague here is Agent Butler." I look across at the two young agents sitting across from me as their frozen expressions fixate on me. "Agents, are you FBI? Or something?" I nervously asked. One of the agents gave a disgruntled laugh as if I offended him. "Close. We're with the CIA. What do you want with me?" I didn't know dying was illegal. The two men sat upright as one of them put a picture of a woman in front of me. "We need your help with a delicate situation. It's of the utmost importance to the security of this country." I looked down at the picture of a woman who looked strangely enough like me. Apart from her expensive-looking attire and different colored hair, we had the same facial features and we looked to be the same height. The woman in the picture is the wife of the Russian Minister for Defense, Sergei Shoigu, said the agent with a sound of urgency in his voice. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked. "She has a lot of secrets that could be very important to us. The problem is her husband isn't a nice man. Fortunately for us, he treats her like a dog, so she wants a way out of the marriage. But being the man he is, he's not going to let her go so easily." I still don't get what this has to do with me. The two agents look at each other before fixating their stares at me again. Sergei is a very powerful man. Even if we got her out of the country, we couldn't guarantee her safety. The only way we could do that is if we faked her death. But it has to look convincing, and that is where you come in. It suddenly began to make sense. I remember a guy friend of mine who was big into conspiracy theories and would always bang on about how the moon landings were faked in a studio. So would I be correct in thinking you want me to make another movie, given my special talent? The two agents look at each other again, but this time with a smile. She catches on quick. I'm beginning to like her already. I picked up the picture again and stared at the woman looking back at me with pain in her eyes and a painted-on smile. How much does this gig pay? Story 9. The gambling man. Jesse awoke in a place he didn't immediately recognize, though it was hard to tell. The dimly lit room gave away few secrets. There were a few things he could tell, however. He was seated in a rather comfortable, tall chair. The upholstery, despite its apparent weathering, was still enough to catch the eye. Its bright crimson-colored fabric almost seemed to draw you in, and the wood was heavy and natural. The age seemed to do little in regard to that part of his seat. Its deep stain made it seem timeless and untouchable. What he noticed next began to set his grasping mind at ease. He was seated at a table, but this wasn't just any old table. This was a poker table. The green felt with its black and red outlines and markings had an instant soothing effect on him. If there was any sense of calm, however, it was quickly shattered by a booming voice ordering him to ante up. He looked down and saw his pile of chips neatly stacked in denominations ranging from low to high. He didn't recall anyone else sitting at the table with him when he first woke up. But now, as he surveyed the room, he noticed one other player, seated directly across from him, hanging back in the shadows. Taking a deep breath, he put his chips in the betting circle. Jesse wasn't sure what they were playing for, but he had a feeling it was important. Really, asshole? There's literally nobody behind me. Jesse cursed at the car that had pulled out in front of him, going slower than he'd have liked. He always seemed to have such an even temper, even in situations where it could be quite easy to lose your cool. The car, however, that was a danger zone. The minute Jesse stepped in and started down the road, it would be fairly easy for him to hurl a dozen insults in a matter of blocks. He wouldn't consider himself a rude person by any means, maybe a little jagged around the edges. To some, though, he could be downright sharp. That came with the territory, he figured. Being a self-made man gave you a few entitlements, especially if you were a risk-taker like him. Being a semi-pro poker player meant that he had to take calculated risks on a daily basis. Some paid off and some didn't. That was all part of playing the game. The opportunity to take a chance that may put you 2, 5, or even 10 steps ahead in life. It was this aspect of his chosen profession that intrigued him more than any jackpot ever could. Looking and listening to people and situations, trying to find the exploit that would give him the advantage going forward. Sometimes this could get him in trouble. He'd been threatened before, sure, but nothing he couldn't talk himself out of. After passing this Sunday driver on a Friday afternoon, Jesse could return to the rest of his guilty pleasures. The open road, loud music, and most definitely a joint or two. For him, the three were so complementary, he couldn't imagine one without the other. It would be like trying to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich without the bread. Finding a good place to start on his custom playlist, he turned the dial up a little bit and set it to shuffle. Pulling out his pack of cigarettes, he slid out one of the pre-rolled doobies he'd brought along and lit it up. With a deep inhale and his focus on the road amplified by the music, his thoughts began to settle on the task at hand. He was on his way to Atlantic City for some invite-only poker tournament. The buy-in was 15 grand, but Jesse had sensed an easy payday. The invite had been poorly made, and the hosting establishment was some tattered hole in the wall. Not to be confused with an actual casino. This was going to be a backroom game. It was games like these that were Jesse's bread and butter. He usually placed so well that he considered them free money. He had developed an uncanny ability to read people like a book. Tell, or no tell, In just a few seconds study, Jesse knew whether or not he could beat you. It was a gift, really, one he had used on more occasions than he could count, not just in his professional setting, but with people he knew on a day-to-day basis. He could use it to manipulate people and situations until he got the outcome he wanted. It came rather easily to him. In the beginning, he would feel guilty about using his powers for evil, but if he wasn't supposed to use them, then why did the universe gift them to him? Some guitar and harmonica blues piece blared through the speakers of Jesse's moderately expensive sports coupe. The smoke was streaming from the windows like the exhaust on a coal-powered locomotive, and Jesse had never been more relaxed. With Atlantic City no more than an hour away, he began to contemplate what he would spend his winnings on this time. A smile crossed his face as he began to think of the poor saps about to be taken to the cleaners. He inhaled, chuckled, and cruised toward his destination. He was completely unaware that this time was going to be unlike any other time that had come before, ever. Jesse looked at the stranger, who was still cloaked in shadow, and then back down to his chips. What had begun as towers of white, green and black had dwindled down to little more than small outposts. The safety that he had felt with them had waned the more he lost. He wouldn't last much longer if things kept going this way, playing close to the chest. He was only betting on hands. He knew he had a shot at winning. It would seem, however, that Lady Luck was not on his side tonight. No matter how good his hand was, the stranger was better, even Jesse's full house. Aces over kings didn't hold up to the stranger's four of a kind. As if to rub it in his face, it was comprised of nothing but twos. Jesse decided that if he didn't do it now, he may not get a chance to make his move. No more tiptoeing through the tulips and walking on eggshells. He was going to use every trick in the book, and even a few that he invented. And he hoped that he could get a little help from his gift. Almost on cue, he heard the stranger laugh. It was not like anything he had ever heard before. Low and guttural, it was like a laugh being played back on a slowed-down tape. It was unnatural. And with that, the stranger began to lean forward. Jesse had made it to the final table in his little backroom adventure. He had fared pretty well for most of the evening, giving him a decent chip count going into the final table. Here, 6 other gentlemen were also seated, all wanting to claim that top prize. If Jesse could hold out and win here, he was looking at a cool 100 grand payout. The first few rounds went just as expected. He didn't play too many hands, but on those he did, he raked it in. After the second blind increase, though, something in him felt different. He felt slightly sick, and he couldn't focus long enough on the cards to formulate a plan. It didn't take very long for his marginal lead to landslide down to almost nothing, but Jesse, being the professional that he was, still had a few tricks up his sleeve. Quite literally. He had another skill that he believed all poker players should possess. He was a master at close-up card magic. The dealers had just been switched, so Jesse knew he had some time to work with. On one of the first throwbacks to the dealer, he palmed an ace and slid it in his sleeve. After a few more hands and credit almost at the breaking point, he palmed another and waited. It wouldn't be long until on the flop of the next hand an ace came out. He covered his chips, counting, make it seem like a life or death decision was about to be made, unknown to Jesse at the time. He had set that path in motion quite some time ago. All in, he declared. As the opponents at the table were occupied with the spectacle occurring on the table, Jesse switched the pair in his hand for the one in his sleeve. He had a few people bite on what was looking to be a move that would at least triple his money. As the rest of the hand played out, the turn a jack of spades and the river a 2 of diamonds helped no one. Jesse knew he had won. As he gave his cards back to the dealer, he made sure that all 4 of them were flush, so that they appeared to be one card. He took the cards from Jesse and began to shuffle, and the electricity had sparked in the air. He had gotten away with it, and he was going to make a run at that grand prize. As the dealer was dealing out the cards for the next round, she skipped Jesse. Twice, as he was about to object and complain, he felt a sharp snap on the back of his head, and everything went dark. In the blackened room, where light seemed to be a precious resource, it took forever for the stranger to reveal his face. Though, in all seriousness, you couldn't really call it a face. Naked, the stranger wore a skull where his head should be. teeth exposed in a permanently ghastly grin. Instead of being the ivory white one would expect, the skull was stained and almost nicotine yellow, giving it an ageless quality. In place of eyes, two embers glowed fiercely. Unblinking, Jesse could feel the heat as they stared at him. He knew that he should be afraid. More than afraid, in abject terror. Then he felt it, first in the pit of his stomach as just a tingle. Then it was like a bomb went off. As it grew exponentially, feeling it rush up his throat, he wouldn't be able to control it. The laughter burst out and seemed to fill the endless room. "Ooh boy, you had me going there for a minute," he said as he regained control. "I thought we were playing an honest game, friend. Take the mask off." There was no reply, only silence, and with Jesse's laughter dissipated, the silence seemed to carry a weight with it. He could feel it all around him, slowly squeezing his ribcage and cutting off his air. It was almost if he were going to drown in a room full of air. Then the realization dawned on him. This was the horror that he hadn't initially felt. But it was more than that. It felt like he was a rabbit cornered by a cunning fox, biding his time before the kill. "This is no mask, Jesse, and I suggest you regard your situation a bit more serious." It spoke without moving its mouth. Nonetheless, Jesse heard every word loud and clear in his head. "My name is Azrael, better known in your world as the Angel of Death. The game we've been playing here is for your very life, and I'm afraid you're not faring very well. I thought with poker being your game of choice, you'd have done a bit better. I'm disappointed, really. However, I must warn you, time is not on your side. Even with how slow it moves here, we're speeding toward your obliteration. So again, I suggest that you buckle down, and if you're going to make a move, you better do it quick." Well then, looking at his chip stacks, Jesse smiled and replied, "I guess let's get to it." When Jesse came to, he found himself in a rather unique high-backed chair. The uniqueness did not come from antiquity or some other unmeasurable quality. It was quite simple, actually. It was designed to accommodate straps, one for the neck and one for both wrists and ankles. There was no room in the design for any slack. They were tight and unforgiving. He also suddenly became aware of the pain that radiated out from his face and head. He was pretty sure his left eye was swollen shut. His vision was blurry and distorted. He couldn't quite make out any distinct details, but he did see shapes, which he assumed were his captors. The wet, slightly sticky substance on the back of his neck told him they probably clubbed him at the table and drug him back here, wherever here was. "Good morning, sunshine," one of the shapes growled at him. That's when the gun went off, just mere inches from Jesse's head. The sound was shattering, literally, as he could feel faint trickles of blood drip from his one ear. There was some more talking, but nothing that Jesse could understand. To him it all sounded like the grown-ups from Charlie Brown. He could make out one thing though, and only because of the sound it made: laughter. Whoever these people were, it sounded as if they were enjoying themselves. The more he struggled, the more pain they inflicted and the more they laughed. He guessed with all the stunts he had pulled over the years, this was his way of paying them back. Karmic justice in a nutshell. Though as much as he felt he deserved it, he couldn't help not wanting to die, strapped to that chair, in some dirty warehouse who knows where, with the laughter reaching a fever pitch and dominating every part of his being. There was only one thing he could think of. He wasn't sure why, but it started out as a whisper and gradually got louder. Eventually, with one giant shout from inside his mind, all in, he banished all their laughter, and everything fell silent. Jan was in the back of the bank, preparing for her shift like she did every day, counting her drawer, filling out paperwork and making sure her cube was stocked for the day. It was early enough in the day that she was still the only one there, and would be for the next half an hour. Usually they didn't open with only one employee on staff, but being the branch manager, she decided to open anyway. She was in front of the store with her back to the door, finishing up some of her paperwork when she heard the buzzer for the door chime. "Be with you in just a moment," Jan sounded out, routinely from her place behind the counter. When she finally turned around to help her first customer of the day, she thought she was going to vomit. In fact, later that day, she would not be able to keep herself from upchucking uncontrollably for hours. The shock, however, was enough to keep everything in place. In front of her stood a man that had no business being where he was. Her eyes were immediately pulled to the gaping hole in the middle of the man's forehead. Maggots crawled and squirmed their way around deep inside the wound. Jan was almost positive that she could see straight through to the doors behind him, but that couldn't be right. Then, from a mouth that looked like it had several teeth knocked out with a hammer, a simple request was asked. "Can I make a deposit? Just won the biggest poker game of my life." Story 4. My name is Alison, and I'm a snuff film star. No, I don't have the source for the movies, and before you ask, it's not mainstream porn you can find by just Googling my name. They're videos of me being murdered. Where would you even find those types of videos? The dark web, maybe? I don't know. I don't like watching myself being murdered. What I can tell you is, I've starred in over 50 movies, and according to the guy who distributes them, I'm the most watched and most sought-after snuff star in history, if that's even a thing. You're probably wondering how one would even get into that business. Well, the short answer is by accident. You don't wake up one day and decide you want to be murdered. In my case, I answered an ad looking for an amateur porn actress. I was just starting out in the business, and the pay seemed reasonable. When I arrived at the location, which was a house in an upmarket location, it didn't raise any red flags. It all seemed legit until I asked to be paid up front, and the response was, "Let's see how you die first." Before I knew it, I was being held down and the cameras began rolling. All I can say is dying is like going to sleep during surgery. It's painful at the start and scary. But when your heart starts slowing down, you get a rush of euphoria and everything goes silent before the lights go out. I couldn't tell if there was an afterlife. I don't stay dead long enough to find out. It's like going to sleep without dreaming. There's a nanosecond of darkness before you wake up again. You would think that a guy whose business is death would be easily scared. But when I suddenly woke up as they were loading me into a shallow grave in the woods, he screamed like a little girl. It took some time to calm him down. You would swear it was him that was just brutally murdered with the way he reacted. But once the initial shock wore off, he looked me dead in the eye, no pun intended, and said, "I'm going to make you a fucking star." I can't go into details on how I get snuffed out, but I can say the money is great, more than I could ever make being in mainstream porn. The problem isn't the fact that my employer is a death dealer of women. Actually, no women have been murdered apart from me, of course, since I started. The problem is the reaction I'm starting to get the more my popularity grows. The surprising thing is, the people who notice me are the most ordinary people you could imagine, not monsters that hide away in the shadows fantasizing about murdering women. I mean school teachers, doctors, and even young teenagers. The biggest shock for me was when I was sitting in a cafe and I was approached by a young dad who had his 2 young daughters with him. He sat staring at me while his daughters sat eating chocolate muffins. I knew why he was looking at me, even if he didn't. As I was finishing up my latte, I looked up to see him standing next to me with a strange grin on his face. "Do I know you from somewhere?" he suddenly asked. I was in my comfort clothes, a baggy t-shirt with a pair of sweatpants, and the tattoo of a pentagram on my arm was on show. He began studying me to figure out how he knew me, and when I was just about to speak, he noticed the tattoo on my arm. It was like a light switched on in his brain, and he suddenly realized where he knew me from. His face turned deathly pale, and he began to stutter a bit before he hurried himself and his daughters out of the cafe. I was never really worried about being noticed before, because the men that watched me expected me to be dead. I also never gave a second thought to my tattoo being the thing that gave me away. I mean, how many girls out there have the same tattoo? When I got it done, I was told it was a popular choice. That all changed when I got a phone call from my mother. My poor mother had no clue about the type of business I was in. She always thought I was into some lifestyle stuff, like a trainer to the stars or something. I think the dream was better than the reality, and she always told her friends I was a successful businesswoman of some sort. Technically, she wasn't wrong. All that changed when she rang me in hysterics. She could barely contain herself over the phone. "You're alive. You're alive. is all she kept on repeating down the phone. After I calmed her down and reassured her I was very much alive, I waited until her breathing had slowed to a more relaxed state. Alison. For a moment I thought I was speaking to a ghost. My mother was always my biggest fan in life, and it broke my heart to hear her this upset. The police were here. Men in suits. Detectives, I think. They told me you were dead. Oh, my sweet girl, they told me you were dead. They had found blood and something about a tape or the internet. The bastards gave me a heart attack. I knew you weren't dead. That night, I went to stay with my mother, just to reassure her that I was still physically present and to just hug her. Mainly to reassure myself that I was definitely still present in this world. Deep down, I knew what this was about. Of course, someone who wasn't a degenerate monster was going to watch my movies and try to put a name on the woman who should be somewhere in a shallow grave. But I always thought people would think the movies were just great fakes because you can only be the star of one snuff movie, not 50. A few weeks had passed, and apart from my mother losing a year or two of her life, things had settled down. I had decided to quit. It was never going to be a long-term thing, but if I was going to stop, my final movie was going to be my best. Go out with a bang, I always say. It was the day of the shoot, and on the way to the location, I couldn't escape the feeling I was being watched. I put it down to my nerves because I was going to die in the most brutal way possible. It was going to be so bad no one was ever going to think it was faked. And the fact it was going to be the last video of me made it sound all the more believable. I knew it was going to be painful, but the pain never lasted, and all I was thinking was, it's going to be a spectacular death, and it was. But as the euphoria swept over me and I began to slip into the darkness, I watched as men in SWAT gear burst into the room, followed by men in suits. As always, I came back to life with a big gasp of air, like a baby taking its first breath after being expelled from the womb. I was expecting to be in the room where I was murdered, but this time I found myself on a cold metal slab. As I looked around what looked like an operating room, I saw two men in suits. One was smiling, while the other appeared to hand over money from his wallet. "Hi, welcome back. I just bet my colleague $50 that you would come back from the dead," he said as he put the note into his top pocket. "I must say, I am a big fan of your movies. Damsel in the Dungeon is my personal favorite," said the smartly dressed man as he smiled down at me. This was the first time I had ever felt in danger. A sudden panic washed over me as I tried to get up off the table. The two men in suits smiled at each other before handing me a hospital gown. "Where am I?" I asked nervously. "You have nothing to worry about. It's not like we are going to kill you," said one of the men as they burst out laughing. The two men walked me to an interview room and sat me down at a table opposite them. "You still haven't told me who you are and my reasons for being here." The two men adjusted themselves into a more serious posture. "Sorry for the confusion. My name is Agent Harris and my colleague here is Agent Butler." I look across at the two young agents sitting across from me as their frozen expressions fixate on me. "Agents, are you FBI? Or something?" I nervously asked. One of the agents gave a disgruntled laugh as if I offended him. "Close. We're with the CIA. What do you want with me?" I didn't know dying was illegal. The two men sat upright as one of them put a picture of a woman in front of me. "We need your help with a delicate situation. It's of the utmost importance to the security of this country." I looked down at the picture of a woman who looked strangely enough like me. Apart from her expensive-looking attire and different-colored hair, we had the same facial features and we looked to be the same height. The woman in the picture is the wife of the Russian Minister for Defense, Sergei Shoigu, said the agent with a sound of urgency in his voice. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked. "She has a lot of secrets that could be very important to us. The problem is her husband isn't a nice man. Fortunately for us, he treats her like a dog, so she wants a way out of the marriage. But being the man he is, he's not going to let her go so easily. I still don't get what this has to do with me." The two agents look at each other before fixating their stares at me again. Sergei is a very powerful man. Even if we got her out of the country, we couldn't guarantee her safety. The only way we could do that is if we faked her death. But it has to look convincing, and that is where you come in. It suddenly began to make sense. I remember a guy friend of mine who was big into conspiracy theories and would always bang on about how the moon landings were faked in a studio. So would I be correct in thinking you want me to make another movie, given my special talent? The two agents look at each other again, but this time with a smile. She catches on quick. I'm beginning to like her already. I picked up the picture again and stared at the woman looking back at me with pain in her eyes and a painted-on smile. How much does this gig pay? Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.